All right, we are live. Finally, sorry for the delay, ladies and gentlemen. My laptop decided to take crap on me all at once. Not in the 30 minutes it took to prepare for the stream, but in the last single second. So, miracles of technology: 2 steps forward, 5 steps back, yada yada yada. But anyway, I am very glad to have with me here today someone I've been very looking forward to having a discussion with, and another person. Another person who will help moderate this discussion as well, as he'll sort of be the go-between for us here. I have with me uh, Ray Murasami and Nero of Rome. So they're pretty infamous through one way or another. I think Ray from her experiences with AA, but of course on Twitter as well. And Nero has sort of that same demure to himself. So if you guys want to say hi real quick, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, it's good to be here.
All right. We wanted to that chaotic high was all we needed. We wanted to real quickly try and recap some of the stream I did with AA, right, when the whole taxation as theft stream.
Oh yeah, the one from yesterday.
That deserves at least a little bit of addressing, only because it was so much of a shit show at once. I want to now, as a participant, I kind of got a one-sided view of things, but I want to hear where you guys, as viewers, sort of stood on the whole thing and how that went.
Well, the thing is, I don't even know whether I should reveal the fact that I was kind of like in the background for that, because I sensed that they actually wanted me to attend that stream for some reason, but I've been boycotting them anyway, so obviously I wasn't going to show up. And so I was kind of seeding my arguments in the background to two persons, one of them who was you. And it was so cringe, because what ended up happening was Ghost of Buckley was there, and he tried to make the bizarre argument that that the state is justified because theft is acceptable, because it's okay to steal food from people if you are starving, which was because it is not theft, which was probably the worst sequence of arguments to justify the state that I've probably ever seen in my life.
Yeah, absolutely.
If Buckley were striving on the side of Academic Agent and Elizabeth, he could have done no better.
Well, it was such an odd argument to make, and I ended up winding sort of half-heartedly defending it, even though I didn't want to make that argument, because it was like I got where he was coming from, in the sense that there's a context to rights that goes beyond sort of the negative rights, positive rights dichotomy, and that has to encompass like the whole wellness of a human being and the ability to actually live a life proper. I wanted to almost get into some of what Hegel thought in his concept of rights, but it devolved so quickly from that point that we didn't even have the chance.
It was primarily, I think, because Academic Agent decided to suddenly start calling you a petty moralist.
Yeah, he called everything that I wanted to do just moral fagging and dismissed it out of hand, which I thought was pretty fucking dumb, because it was...
he's essentially turning into an ANCAP.
Yeah, he really is. All of his arguments are something he quoted Rothbard multiple times in the stream. And, as someone who's read a good bit of Rothbard myself, I was incredibly surprised by it, because I didn't think, I get he's kind of going through like that. He started at one point of like classical liberalism and is moving his way to like the extremes of the ideology, but there's so much wrong with like the early Rothbardianism that I think he's doing, and I find it so weird that he's trying to endorse what is essentially a stateless society, although I guess he's only defining a state as like what's arisen from like the late 17th and late 18th and early 19th century onwards. So like it's not stateless per se, but it's stateless in his sense. It was very, very weird.
Yeah, you know what? I've
had this argument with him several times now as well, because I saw him say this quite a while ago when I asked him about the state before, and he said that the state did not exist until the 17th century. And I was kind of thinking, really? Because I kind of feel like that's wrong.
Yeah, it's like if you wanted to find... Gabriel brought it up that in the point of the other stream, that it was something to do with modern political theory, like the state as we know it didn't exist until like the Enlightenment. But if you want to talk about it like that, then all right, then can we at least just call the other things that existed prior to that forms of government and ask whether or not you think those are necessary? Because like we're
And
not
also,
just debating the existence of the
Yeah.
neoliberal state, we're existing the
of the
existence
state in
of
general. And so,
yeah.
really, someone should have demanded that the state be defined as something like the use of force to um, to further the ends of a particular class which understands itself to be a collective group. Something like this. That way, you could actually apply that to anyone, including, say, the pharaoh and his supporters in Egypt or something.
Yeah, exactly. But whether it's the pharaoh in Egypt or the later aristocracy that came to power in feudal and absolutist Europe and things like that, it was
Exactly.
a
I think
really
that
narrow
I think
talking
the
point.
and also I think the reason that they're trying not to have the state defined that way is because they have this ideological outlook they've taken now, which is where they're trying desperately to make it so that if you were to have a society that consisted entirely of landlords, which is what you end up with if you do Rothbard's ideas and take them to their logical conclusion,
Mhm.
if you end up with something like that, they're trying to claim that this is not government. And so the reason why they don't want the broad definition of what a state is because they're afraid that the thing that they're supporting could be defined as a state under that logic.
Yeah, and it's kind of like what Hoppe tries to do the runaround to avoid. Like he's essentially he's tacitly admitted that some form of state is necessary, or at least that the functions of the state are necessary. He's just actively trying to tell us that they should all be privatized and it should all be made
Yeah.
voluntary,
And
yada
we
yada
should
yada.
kind of all cover our eyes and pretend that it's not actually the use of coercion and that it's not a state, even though it behaves exactly like a state, kind of looks like
Yeah.
a state, and will still kill you like a state.
Yeah, pretty
Yeah,
much.
exactly. And I would argue that anarcho-capitalism, as an ideology, would easily result in an oligarchy or a plutocracy because essentially the wealthiest of individuals would be able to acquire whoever acquires the largest mercenary army would basically control that society, and that is essentially the thing
Yeah.
is that the best argument against anarcho-capitalism is that the alternatives to the state, especially on a macro level, is worse.
Oh yeah, I would agree with that. It's something I tried to bring up in the process of debate. Um, it was the
Yeah.
idea of network effects with defense firms and things like that. And this is something uh, Trudell Tom brought up in his video when he was talking to people along the lines of like Shane Killian and Esoteric Entity. This idea that the service that a thing provides.
Hello?
I hope his computer hasn't suddenly crashed or that something weird hasn't happened.
Yeah, like you just stopped talking.
Yeah. Pragmatic, if you're out there, realize that your microphone is not working.
Hopefully his laptop didn't crash on him again, and he left.
Oh, I think the stream just died. Are we back?
No, we're back. I think it's still live.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
never left.
Yeah, hopefully that doesn't happen a lot. But yeah,
Jesus
basically, well,
Christ.
basically, yeah, the alternatives to the state, like sure, maybe you can start like these anarchist communities here and there, and maybe that will work on a small scale. But otherwise, the alternatives to the state is worse, and that just doesn't just apply to anarcho-capitalism. I would even argue it applies to anarcho-communism. Essentially, the state is a natural consequence of human biology, right? We form groups or communities so that way we assign certain roles to people so that way society can be stabilized and therefore we can pass on our genes throughout the generations, right? So the state is a natural institution. It is a natural consequence of human biological functions.
And even if it wasn't, you should still create it anyway.
Yeah.
This is,
Well,
and also this is one of those things where I think the question that was asked in that stream that you were on was wrong anyway. How did they phrase it again? I think the question was, is yeah, they phrased it as is taxation theft, which is something that Academic Asian does quite a lot. He'll have the stream title be something that's obviously going to allow him to win easily, which is why I was saying you should change the title of that stream when you were doing it to something like, does the modern state provide a worthwhile value added effect to economic activity?
yeah, I
Because
was
then you could just say that taxation is indeed theft, but it's a necessary theft which must take place because the consequences of that theft are actually better than if you didn't do it.
yeah, I was willing to kind of let him have the whole I was willing to have the debate about whether or not it's theft because I was willing to play around with definitions and try to, get the idea that theft is unjustified, therefore, taxes are justified, so it's not theft. I was willing to try to play around with that a little bit, but you're right. After a certain point, it should have been, yes, it's theft, but it's necessary theft because it seemed like that's the only way people actually would have, it would have gotten through their heads at least.
You could also
Exactly.
argue that, at least in democratic societies like in the United States, if you don't want to pay taxes, then you can move to the sub-Sahara Desert or some other area or region in the world where taxation is minimal or doesn't even exist. So, in fact, that's what a lot of people are doing with businesses. People are offshoring their businesses to countries with little to no taxation. So if
Well,
you
I
really
think
hate taxes, just move. Just move outside the United States or whatever country you're in and don't pay taxes. It's voluntary, at least in democratic societies. At least to a
well,
large extent, it's voluntary.
Also, I think that
I'm not a
many of
fan
these
of
people.
that argument only because I would say it's like movement isn't doesn't come freely. It has a lot of built-in costs to it. And I don't think the,
Yeah,
move to Somalia idea is great because it's not like those are tax-free societies, so to speak.
exactly.
You're
The
just
tax is still there. It's just built in a different way.
yeah, you're just paying off warlords to not murder you every 5 seconds.
Pretty
And
That
I
is
much,
true.
which is also
That
a
is
form of
fair. That is fair.
taxation. One of the
yeah.
things that should be pointed out to these guys is that they're living, technically speaking, if you were to actually measure it in terms of the things that you were describing, like, warlords, purchasing power, and all this kind of stuff, they're already living in the most low tax environment you can find on the earth. I mean, if they're standing in New York City, for example, they may complain the taxation seems to be, quote, high, but compared to what?
Hmm. Yeah. Um and Caps, man. It's just like I mean, I think I agree with it you said, Nero, that anarchists broadly are people who are unwilling to deal with a lot of realistic calculations that need to be put into how society functions. And of course, when that's broadly speaking, but if you look, I think if you look at the whole picture, you come out with the idea that even if you don't like a state, some form of it is necessary one way or the other, whether it's this supposed like commune of workers that are acting through some sort of direct vote with some sort of coupon that's not really money, whatever, or whether it's through like, paying your McMurks to go out and stop your neighbor from accidentally sweating on your lawn as he jogs past, thus violating your nap. Uh, I think it's all, you know, you can look at an anarchist and say, well, all right, you don't really have the best perception of reality possible. But I think we've spent enough time dealing with what happened on AA stream. I'd like to move on to some questioning of Ray, if that's all right with you guys.
Yeah, sure, why not?
All right, so I first found out about you, Ray, through the unpopular opinion stream, and I thought it
Really?
was yeah. I had never come across you before that, but one of the things I noticed when you were on there is that you very rarely had a non-substantive point. You always had something that was sticking into the issue, and
Hmm.
it always gave AA the most trouble. And I thought because he couldn't really provide an answer that didn't inherently condemn his sort of liberal worldview overall. And so,
Yeah, that was kind of the effect I was aiming for.
yeah. But I'd like to know what is it specifically that's been this sort of influence on you? Like, is there any literature or philosopher, or like, what do you take most of your thought from?
I'm almost reluctant to answer that question directly because then people will have the way to decode what I'm doing. Can I pass on that question for the moment?
Well, I'm gonna prod just a little bit more because you did once describe yourself. I remember. I think it was on the stream with Friended when you were
Oh,
describing why you left. You did describe yourself as a Fabian Socialist, and so I'd like to know a little bit more about what you meant by that.
okay, yeah. Um, I'll be willing to do that. Okay, so imagine that you're trying to construct socialism, except rather than going about it by driving directly toward the target, instead you go about it via gradualist and reformist methods.
Hmm.
And so
Okay,
what you're
so
doing
it's
really is you're actually going with the flow of the development of capitalism instead of assuming that you can just meet it head on.
okay.
And of course, what is the purpose of that in the first place? The purpose is the same purpose which is behind everything, the same purpose as to why capitalism was established in the first place. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to remove obstacles to efficient forms of production, right? So we transition out of feudalism into capitalism in the first place because capitalism is more efficient than feudalism is. And then when capitalism reaches its historical, eventually reaches its structural limits, we transition out of that and begin to build socialism.
Hmm.
And what
So,
is,
so
and of course, one of the things that characterizes socialism really, I mean, if you're looking for something tangible to hold on to, because people often ask the question, how do you know when socialism is beginning to actually happen around you? You're looking for reduction of labor time, really. Once you have reduction of labor time happening as a trend, and you're able to actually just say, okay, well maybe we should have like a 4 day week, for example, and you start cutting down on the amount of time that people are doing work, then probably when you're in halfway through a transition to socialism, you're in there somewhere.
okay, interesting. So you're taking what I could assume is a much more, for lack of a better term, dialectic approach to it, because it's rather than approaching it from a revolutionary standpoint and trying to force the hand of history, so to speak, you're more willing to say, well, the hand of history will just play itself out in our favor anyway. So what we
Well,
can
I
do
wouldn't
is
be as
just
deterministic as that. I wouldn't be as deterministic in that. There are opportunities which are presented to us, and we still have to obviously take action in the real world to make sure that these things
of
occur.
course, yeah.
But yes, there is a trend. But obviously, if you were to sit there and do nothing, then obviously nothing would happen.
Right. Okay. And so when you talk about what would you say some of the opportunities that have presented itself currently are that you would think that the current left is either has taken advantage of or needs to take more
Or is
advantage
failing to
of?
take advantage of. Okay, well, it depends on which angle you want to look at it from. If you look at it from a third world perspective, an angle which the left is presently not taking sufficient advantage of is that people on the left really need to start becoming like, I mean, it's already being done, but it needs to be done more. There needs to be more championing of free trade. And I say this because of the fact that if you're moving productive capacity into the periphery, where there is so little of it, that's precisely what you would want to do because if you don't have that productive capacity in the third world, then how do you build socialism out of capacity that you don't have?
So in order to promote sort of a global, I don't want to say uprising because it's much more incrementalist than that. But in
Mm,
order to advance the sort of socialist agenda, it's necessary to have everybody in a place where they can begin to have that, say, reduction of work hours and begin to
correct.
properly make that transition.
Absolutely, absolutely. You see, you've got it in one. And so, on the first world side, in terms of opportunities that are being taken up, well, I mean, you're American, right? So, I mean, I guess we can
Yeah.
use America as an example. When you have something like Donald Trump in power, for example, I mean, that's an opportunity. And I say, and people may be surprised, how is that an opportunity? Well, the reason it's an opportunity is because I get the feeling sometimes that politics in the first world is kind of like a pendulum, right? Where you kind of, you push the pendulum a little bit to the left, for example, and then you have like this massive kind of populist right wing freak out, which then drags the pendulum so far to the right that you end up afterwards with an entire generation of people who have been abused by this process, who then pull the pendulum all the way back to the left after it's finished. And so, what I'm anticipating, and if you look at the polls and the way they're playing out, in terms of if you just divide it down by age, you
Hmm.
have an entire generation of people that are at least some kind of extreme something. So the project there, I think that the left would have to then deal with is how do you find people who are aged between 18 to let's say 35, 18 to 35, how do you get them in a direction where you can have them supporting consistently over multiple electoral cycles, because it is more important to have consistency over electoral cycles than to have a single spurt of radicalism. So you want consistency over electoral cycles of social democracy in the United States. That would be the beginning process, which I think people need to get on board with. You don't necessarily need to be very radical about it, but you just need to have consistently electing social democrats, and so they can put in their programs consistently. And the kind of programs I'm talking about are the kind of programs that would actually raise the cost of labor, because you don't want to reduce the cost of labor, you in fact want to raise it. Why? Because raising the cost of labor means that on the one hand you've got I guess you have a commensurate rise in union politics and people getting the kind of wages that they want. But at the same time, there's another side effect to this, which is that you end up, paradoxically perhaps, in some people's opinion, you end up with less jobs. Why is this? Because there's only so much that a company can afford to pay sort of, a basic level worker to do a particular job. So let's say that someone came out and said that, everyone must have $15 an hour in the United States. What do you think would happen?
Undoubtedly, you would have less people being able to be employed because
okay, good.
can't
So I'm going to add to that. I'm going to add to that.
Yeah.
Now, what happens if I came onto that and also said, let's have also Medicare for all? What do you think would happen then?
Much less jobs because of the cost of how taxes would have to be raised in order to support such a system.
Yes, correct. But your name is Jeff Bezos. Do you actually have a problem with that, or do you just automate the jobs that you can't pay for?
You would automate the jobs, obviously.
Indeed, you would automate them. And the ones you can automate, what do? Well, since free trade is in effect, you offshore them. So, in terms of people who have then, quote, lost their jobs, right? You take them, you retrain them for something that is better than the manual labor that they were previously engaging in, because obviously it's not a very secure job if it can be replaced by a manual labor machine.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've essentially moved them into a place where they're far more self-sufficient than they were in the first place. There is no downside to this, you see. And in the process of doing that, you've essentially elevated the status of people in the first world, so they are no longer complaining at you, and you've also spurred on more developments in the third world, which will eventually cause them to have to go through the exact same process which I just described, in which labor becomes slowly more expensive, and eventually you end up without the sweatshops because they have been replaced by automated machines and so on. And then once you have that parity, where you have the cost of labor in both the first world and the third world is approaching about the same amount, then you notice obviously the offshoring will decline at that point, and you're moving toward another transition.
Okay.
So it's not very methodical if you think about it that way. Obviously, this is very broad strokes which I'm using here, but I mean, you have to.
Yeah, no, I see what you're getting at broadly, and it makes much more sense when you put it like that. Where my point of disagreement would be is that it seems, to put it in somewhat, layman's terms, it seems like what you're almost striving for, in a sense, is fully automated luxury communism, or to use that kind of meme. But is that an inaccurate description, would you say?
I don't like to actually pin myself to that name, but I'll put it this way. When this meme was generated, which they're calling FALC now, or FALC, fully automated luxury communism and that whole thing, like, I was there when that meme was created, so let me just put it that way.
All right, that's very, very interesting. Now, the problem I have with that is it isn't going to simply be that, you raise the cost of labor, more people are unemployed, and they presumably go on the government dole of some kind. So you have to expand all these programs, like you said, Medicare, and you have to raise taxes to do so.
And for the social services, there must be retraining included in that, and that's why it's crucial.
When you say retraining, like ideological retraining?
No. I mean in terms of job retraining, because if a person has lost a job as some very sort of low-skilled job, then to put them back into another low-skilled job just means they'll be very shortly unemployed again soon. So you'd have to retrain them for something that was better than what they were doing before. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
Okay, well, I'll come back to that because that's an interesting idea. But the point I was going to make is that when it comes to the economics behind what you're proposing, broadly speaking, when you have this sort of automation and the cost of labor going up and things slowly become automated, there's a point to which I would say that automation just stops, and you have to have a class of somewhere in there of human beings doing it, whether it's in the law capacity
That's
or
exactly
whether it's...
right. And that's why I'm not anticipating you'd have 100% unemployment or something crazy like this. Although some people have talked about that. But no, I don't think in the near term, I don't think that will happen. And so obviously there will still be jobs that people will be able to have. Just they'll be much less grueling and more cerebral.
Yeah, well, I'd agree. But what I would then say is that in this process, what you've essentially done is you've created this class that is continually reliant on a productive force of an ever shrinking elite. And in order to maintain this massive intermediate welfare state that you've created. And I don't think you can generate enough wealth. It's kind of like the problem. This is a very Austrian talking point, but it's the problem of, eventually I know this is a bad meme to use, but it's the idea of eventually you run out of other people's money, because eventually the people you're taxing from get it in their heads that this whole system is bound to collapse and that their labor is essentially just being spread about amongst all these other people who didn't even work for
I've
it.
certainly heard this criticism, but that's operating on the assumption that you're taxing human beings.
Well, at some point you are, because
at some point you're always taxing human beings, obviously, because that's where the production is happening. But I mean, when you have, if you look at productivity, if a lot of your productivity is coming from automation, then eventually you're taxing corporations. So you'd be taxing, I guess, you'd be taxing capital equipment at some point.
Sure, you're
And what you do is, and one way that you prevent yourself from running into this problem of people coming out for tax protests is that you do stuff like you abolish council tax and you abolish VAT and abolish all kinds of regressive taxes and shift the taxation burden away from individual human beings and onto structures instead.
Well, one thing you do.
So, for example, like for instance, you abolish. For instance, I mean, this is obviously very extreme when I phrase it this way, but for instance, hypothetically, you abolish payroll tax for everyone that works at Toyota, for example, but you leave corporation tax in place.
Sure, no, I understand the idea, but at some point, at one point, you're shifting away taxes from something else. But if you're just eliminating taxes, you have to increase the taxes that remain, obviously, to pay for the system that you're talking about creating. And the other idea would be that eventually you tax something to such a degree that the deadweight loss makes it completely unprofitable to run that business. And eventually you're killing the cash cow that you're trying to milk before you've brought about this system, because eventually...
Isn't that called the rate of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall? Because that is somewhere on the horizon as well. There's a possibility that eventually you'll have
oh, I'm sorry.
How do they phrase it? Profits absorbed into rents. Is that what happens? Something like that, where you end up with what you just described, and then what would you? There's one way for me to go about this. What would you call the thing that you just described?
Well, I would agree.
Where things are being produced, but there's no longer any profits being made.
I would certainly be a situation of the falling rate of profit. But what I would describe as happening next isn't that you begin the transition. What I would describe is, because you've eliminated the incentive structure within the whole of society to be a productive person, you've created a system in which everybody thinks that they are going to get a handout of some sort. And I know this is sort of a very libertarian, free market-esque talking point, but at some point, the psychological necessity for incentives isn't one of just economic concern. It's one of social concern. You need to have people striving to do something in order to, advance society. You need this sort of striving. And I get that creativity
No, but I mean, we could have had that same argument like back at the end of the feudal era or something, where, some people could be arguing that, if we don't have a class of people who are bashing rocks, then what else will they find to do? Well, I mean, we did find out what else they would find to do, right? So wouldn't the same thing happen in this case as well? I don't think you'd have a bunch of idle people just sitting around.
Well,
It just means that there'll be certain things that people would no longer have to do, and so people would find other things to do instead. So productivity would just go up more.
Well, it's not that they wouldn't simply stand around and be idle. They would look for other things to do, but at the end of the day, people need to feel like what they're doing is still worth it. Like, there are a very small class of people that will simply do things for the sake of doing them if it's of no gain to them, even if they have a very strong passion and inclination towards doing it. They need to be rewarded in some way, if not to show that what they're doing is worth it, also to sustain themselves. Because if they feel like they want to get into a productive enterprise like starting a business for the sake of not only status and feeling accomplishment, but also to provide for a family that they wish to start, and they feel like, well, if I just start this business, all my proceeds are essentially going to go to all these different people who are doing nothing. Why should I even waste my time? Because I'm not going to get anything out of it. Even though I feel strongly about it, it's just not in my best interest to go about organizing my life as such. And so I think the problem is less so that people won't find new things to do, but rather they won't feel inclined to do those new things.
Well, how high are you anticipating the taxation would be for that to actually happen, though?
For the system you're describing that would be implemented, pretty freaking high, because it's, again, I know it's not quite fully automated luxury communism, but it's a system very close to what Bernie Sanders once described, and the math has been done on what it would take to fund a system like his, and it ain't pretty, just to say the least.
Well, hold on. Well, what is Bernie Sanders doing? Although I'm not a fan of Bernie Sanders, by the way. But I mean, what is he doing that is any different? Or at least what has he advocated is substantively different from what the Labour Party in the UK advocates?
I couldn't say, simply because I don't know British politics well enough to talk about that, but I could tell you some of the stuff that he advocates.
I do think there's some elements of hyperbole that must be somewhere in there, because I'm having difficulty imagining it. Like, I mean, the only two things I mentioned there, at least in the initial stages, were, what was it again? What would happen if you were to have a minimum wage that was at $15, and what would happen if you were to have Medicare for all?
Yeah, well, Medicare for all.
That's effectively what already exists in the United Kingdom.
Well, yeah, there could be a lot to be. There's a lot to be said about your NHS, though, for certain. And I think one of the other things that Bernie Sanders suggested in particular was free college for all. And the reason
the UK also had that up until I can't remember when it stopped.
Why did it stop, though?
I cannot remember. That was an element of politics that obviously I wasn't deeply interested in. But I mean, the United Kingdom
it's a waste of money
during the time which it had it. I think, didn't the UK have it from sometime in the 1970s up until must have been the late 1990s or early 2000s when it stopped. But I don't think the country imploded as a consequence of that.
No, it obviously wouldn't implode if you start a program and then cut it off before it goes too far out of hand. But one of the problems, I think, is with your NHS is, like with a lot of your publicly funded program, is that it's constantly running on serial debt. Like, these are programs that are constantly being unpaid. And I think, what you're describing as, the steps to move towards this next socialist phase are very much taking place in not only the UK, but in large swaths of Europe. And I mean, there are obviously arguments to be made about, well, the US has been providing defense for all these countries essentially for X number of years, so they've had the extra money to funnel into these programs. But even if you were to discount,
I'm not even sure if that's how it goes anyway. Because if you look at NATO calculations, I mean, technically NATO is still spending quite a lot.
Oh yeah, but I mean, who's the largest?
NATO countries in Europe. Obviously, the United States is the largest contributor, but I mean, in terms of the defense of Europe itself, I'm pretty sure. Give me 1 second, because I'm actually going to check this, because this is one of those things where if you don't say it, then you've forgotten to say it. So give me a second.
Can I interject very quickly? I wanted to say something about the free college thing. The thing is that while I thought it was a good idea at first, the fact is that let's be honest. Most degrees college students go after are completely useless. Like, unless you are lucky enough to get into the State Department or whatever, no one's going to fucking hire you because you have a master's in gender studies or a bachelor's in sociology. Now, yeah, because it's just highly competitive. They're very difficult fields to go into. So unless you're lucky enough to get an internship for the State Department, it's practically a useless degree. So in my opinion, I think a compromise on this issue, because college debt is a really big problem here in the States. I think perhaps college could be free, but only for degrees that have a good standing in the job market. For example, engineering, computer science, those degrees guarantee employment. So they should be the ones that are funded by the state. So I think you should look at the job outlook of certain degrees, and then you go on from there. Any comments on that?
Well, I think the larger problem with getting into state-funded degrees becomes the inflation of the degree itself, because obviously, when you're pouring uh, mm, when you're pouring unfettered amounts of cash into anything, obviously the supply of that thing is going to increase. And so when you have the supply of something increase, you are going to have the demand for it, and thus the price of it decrease on some level. And we've seen that with college in general over the past. It's come to a head in the past decade, but it's probably been going on realistically for the past half century, at least 4 decades. Because what the United States government has effectively done is, by guaranteeing student loans, people are entering a college at a rate unseen in previous decades. And what that's allowed to happen is that college degrees have just become, the base requirement because of how common they are. And by doing that, you've made it so that you need to be this sort of college educated fuddy in order to just get an entry level job. And by doing that,
Isn't that going to happen in the future anyway? Because if all of the entry level jobs get taken away by machines, which will happen, then eventually everyone's going to have to go through college anyway.
well, I think the idea that that all automation necessarily leads to fewer jobs for people isn't necessarily true, because at some point you have these machines that are taking the very basic manual labor jobs out. Okay, but who's repairing these machines? Like, if
Indeed. Yeah, I agree with you on that. But what I'm saying is the persons who maintain these will still have to be educated in such a way that they would be able to maintain them. So that either which way, they still have to go to college.
I mean, who do you think
well,
builds those machines? Who do you think builds the machines that replace human labor? It's engineers. So you have to
Indeed,
have
that's why
engineers.
and that's why I was saying earlier that you won't end up with people just sitting around idly, because people will still have to do things. It's just they'll need to be more educated than previously in order to be able to do them. It's
well,
very
Yeah, the
see,
similar
only
to
way
how
you
after
could
the
ever.
hold on, no, wait. It's very similar how after the feudal era, people had to bring in mandatory school up until the end of primary level because of the fact that you couldn't have illiterate people running an economy anymore. And then what happened afterwards? People then had to make secondary school mandatory as well because you couldn't have people who had only completed primary school running the economy anymore. So eventually, you may end up with eventually mandatory university. You can't have people who do not have a university education running your economy anymore.
well, sure, but at some point, you there is a gap that has to be accounted for here in what I would roughly just call human nature, but it has to do with the nature of intelligence itself, and that being that humans don't have the potential to all become equally intelligent. There are some natural barriers in place there that impede a person from obtaining a high level of degree. And so, being that, not everybody can become college educated, even if they want to, if you make society overly complex for this large mass of people who just won't get it, then that large mass of people is going to be incredibly discontent, and they're probably going to end up destroying the system that the educated have built because it's completely alien to them. And so if you don't want that to happen, you have to account for those people, and in order to do that, you're going to have to offer them jobs that can be easily learned in something like a trade school. I mean, we still have plumbers and we still have electricians
And
that go
actually,
to
yes, that's a
trade
good point. That is actually a good point. Yes. So
Yeah,
I don't think
also,
I don't think people should be abolishing trade schools or apprenticeships or things like this. Those will
don't
probably
forget
still continue.
artificial intelligence. Like, what would happen if? Let's be hypothetical here. What if in about 100 years from now, in basically robots would be engineers, so therefore no one would have to work. Like, unless that happens, I could never like. People are worried that your automated society would lead to something like Wall-E, but honestly, I don't see that happening unless you do something insane, like all the engineers that have to maintain all this technology are also technology themselves. So
Which is
well,
that's unlikely to happen as well. Also, I've got my NATO figures up now, so hold on. I'm just going to give you the reason as to why this argument about United States defense doesn't work. So I'm going to be
Sure.
really quick about it because obviously you could be here for hours, but I've sort of distilled it. So you have a United States defense budget. It's really, really big, as you know, but 75% of the United States defense budget does not actually get spent in Europe at all. And it's instead spent in Japan, a place which has been saddled with a pacifist constitution. And, well, pacifism is not very intelligent. But anyway, we go on. South Korea, Thailand, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Afghanistan, and Iraq. So that's 75% of the budget for Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Afghanistan, and Iraq. So the other 25%, then by process of elimination, must be getting spent, let's say, in Europe. Um, so give me a second. Right. And so by the numbers, then, that would mean that United States for the defense of Europe is spending $151 billion, and then other major NATO powers are spending $160 billion, and then other NATO powers outside of the major ones that are in Western Europe are spending $140 billion. This is in contrast to Russia's present defense budget, which is $165.7 billion. So by the number, well, by percentages, what that means is that in total, the amount being spent in NATO is 3 times that of Russia, and if you were to remove the United States from that, it would mean that NATO would be spending twice Russia, and if you were to just ignore Russia and just look at the NATO graph by itself, it means that the Europeans by themselves are spending twice the amount on themselves that the United States is spending on them.
Right.
Or in other words, the United States is spending is paying for about a third of Europe's defense.
Donald Trump is just fucking over his
And so,
powers.
yes, Donald Trump's narrative on this is obviously incorrect. So I'm not even entertaining Donald Trump's narrative on this.
Well, it should be said that if Donald Trump is adding something, I'll let you go just one more second. If the United States is paying even a third of for Europe's defense, that's still quite a massive chunk that, if taken away, would surely have a detrimental effect to how they were paying for as opposed to if they were paying 100% for themselves. Because
very true.
So I think obviously, it's fair to say that Europeans are still paying for themselves mostly. But the United States, it has to be considered, is not only paying for its own defense, but the defense of, its vassal states, so to speak. And so there's a lot to be said about there.
But there's obviously a mutual gain from that, because the United States is able to have products at cheaper prices than they otherwise would have, because of the fact that by collaborating with European nations in NATO for a defensive posture, which is what NATO is about, they're able to safeguard transit routes and routes across which energy travels, meaning that these things are less expensive than they otherwise would have been. So the United States is not failing to benefit from the fact that they contribute to this.
Of course, it's not a pure one-way street. Obviously, if you're the Navy that dominates the Earth as Great Britain once did, then you're going to reap the benefits of having secure trade routes. I mean, that's been the history of empire building throughout the world, is securing trade routes.
That's why so many people in Europe, I mean, particularly, geography majors in general, right? Where everyone was so incredibly baffled by the fact that Trump came out and decided to behave like this was some kind of transactional thing, in which he is the one who is being ripped off.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he pretty much has had everything going his way since 1945. What is there to complain about?
Yeah, no, I think there is a large benefit to that, but at some point, this is what happened with the Roman Empire, of course. The cost of protecting its vassal states and exporting all these different services to these various different principalities eventually began to outweigh the cost of actually keeping them as client states one way or another. And so when you had all this, you had eventually the many divisions of the Roman Empire, first between East and West, and then into the quadrants. And it became such a hassle that we have what is becoming a situation for especially the United States, where the costs are very quickly outrunning the excuse me, I'm very tongue-tied tonight, are outweighing the benefits. And I think NATO, while not being the straw that breaks the camel's back, is certainly a prelude to that.
Well, I'm not sure what the United States would want to do if NATO did not exist. Like, okay, we can just game this out really quickly. Um, like in the ideal world in which I guess you could say isolationist Americans get their way, what
Mm-hmm.
would they do with respect to NATO?
Like if we just left NATO, would you? Is
Yeah,
that
yeah,
what you're
yeah,
saying?
yeah. And if you was to just, well, I'm not suggesting that that's what you would do, but I'm just asking, like, what would they do then if they think that if they came to the belief that somehow the costs outweighed the benefits, even keeping in mind the fact that their ancestors must have fought in the Second World War to establish the thing which they're complaining about in the first place, like,
Hmm.
what would their stance be? Like, what would they want to do?
I would say that their stance is simply that bring the money home in some sense. Like there was the suggestion. There's this constantly brought up when it comes to the whole policy of not simply military spending in foreign nations, but foreign aid in general. Is that you would take that money that we were spending abroad
Hmm.
and we'd use it home somehow. I mean, the interesting political candidate Patrick Little once said, or once suggested, I should say, that you could stop funding Israel to the tune of $3 billion a year and use that money to then pay blacks reparations, which was, it was somewhat of a meme, and obviously he's kind of a joke of a politician, but it was an interesting thought, and it speaks to the sentiment of what Americans would want. It would really be just, we want our money for ourselves. We don't want it globally. And I think Donald
Okay,
Trump
well,
has been very
what about
effective in sort of shifting this sort of sentiment where
hmm,
people are
but
now
what about
willing
the
to
aspect
forsake.
in which what about the aspect in which people would argue that some of this money which is being spent, like obviously I can't speak to the Israel thing, but the rest of it,
Mhm.
um, to what extent is that money already technically being spent on you in some oblique way? For example, let's say that you're using foreign aid to drive down the birth rate in South Africa by paying for the dissemination of materials that encourage decent family planning, right? Now you're
Mhm.
thinking, well, how does this benefit you in some way? Um,
Decreases risk of terrorism. We've been through this before in AA's live stream
indeed,
about this.
indeed, we've had that exact conversation before. So yes, I'm inviting you in, Platonic. Um, yeah. So what he said. So how do you not benefit from that?
Well, I think it's the concept of, yeah, you could certainly make the case that there are a lot of abstract ways that we benefit from the securing of our trade routes overseas through NATO, or through keeping the birth rate of
And
sub-Saharan Africans
foreign
down.
aid and things like this.
Well, can
Because
I ask a
Yeah,
we
question then?
often hear this. Hold on, we often hear this this conversation happen in the United Kingdom as well, where people constantly say, "Oh, what are you spending the foreign aid on?" Um, everything that the foreign aid is spent on. I mean, that includes stuff like media outreach and stuff like this. Has some benefits to the country, I believe, or at least some, or at least the people who are spending it believe that it has some benefits to the country. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it.
sure. Yeah.
Foreign aid is not about just giving money to people because you like them.
Yeah, well, I think what the difference here would be is, one, you could actually debate whether or not these things are having the intended effect or whether they're backfiring. But that I wouldn't prefer to get to that, because my point would be that you have this difference of abstract effects and real effects. It's kind of what Bosche described as the difference between the seen and the unseen. And there are a lot of unseen effects, or there could be a lot of unseen effects in all this foreign aid that the West is giving to the third world. And, we could debate whether or not those effects are actually good and stuff like that. But
I
what
mean,
people mainly
wait.
look for, just to finish here, is that
I apologize.
they want very real, very concrete effects. They don't really care about the abstract. People are very physical things and very emotional things, and they want to see big things done for them here that affect them directly, as opposed to all these little minutia done in the background.
This is something that we noticed this week as well with this thing with Donald Trump. Where did you see that White House event? I can't remember what they called it. It was some extravagant phrase which they had called this event, and Donald Trump basically went there and had a bunch of different CEOs from the United States who were all sitting on these tables, and they have this talk about how they're going to bring jobs to America or something like this. And then he walked across in front of each one of them and had them pledge to him a specific number of jobs that they were alleging they were going to create. And each time one of them would announce the number, Trump would come up with some really shallow way of praising the person who had said this, and then Ivanka would be walking behind him clapping. That was
I
the
did not
weirdest
see
thing I'd
this,
ever
but
seen. Yeah,
this sounds. I have to disagree with you here. That sounds absolutely amazing because it almost sounds like what Trump is doing is recreating the sort of the swearing in of the legions in the forum that the old Roman emperors used to do.
that,
Only it's a
that's
much
that's what
smaller scale.
that's what it made me think of. The thing that you said just now about people want to see a thing which they can tangibly touch.
Oh yeah,
A lot of people in the political class and a lot of my own peers were kind of like, "What on earth is this which is going on?" I was like, "Well, this is the pantomime, right?" I
yeah,
mean,
no,
from my perspective, it still means nothing because these numbers are meaningless, right? Because obviously they're not really going to
potentially.
actually generate these numbers, and obviously it was a pantomime. But clearly, his supporters were really, really amazed by this, and I was thinking, really though, because like I'm sure that Barack Obama had actually done more and better than that. It's just that no one noticed because of the fact that he didn't pantomime it.
Well, yeah, the thing is, I think to use Rome as an example again, although I have a certain somebody in chat telling me that we're Carthage and not Rome. Uh, to use Rome as an example again, Rome had bread and circuses. It provided the bread for its people and it gave it entertainment. And those were the big physical things that it had to do for its people in order to like work on all this little minutia and give it the political capital to continue exist in the fashion it had existed for the couple hundreds of years it was going on existing. But I think that's the big thing. I think we've sort of, or at least the liberal elite, or the neoliberal elite, I should specify, have sort of gotten away from this idea of, sort of catering to the common man in some aspect or another, and have simply thought of them as pawns in a game in order to move them around. And that's not to say that, the people orchestrating breads and circus didn't see the common man in that way, but they were much more aware of how to cater to them than this new sort of intellectual and intelligentsia is, because they have this idea that you can just sort of shove these cheap goods down people's throats, and it sort of ignored the idea that people aren't simply material consumers, but rather there's a psychological longing to them, and that's what the circus was. It wasn't, we obviously have our own version of circus here in the form of sports in the States, be it baseball or football, depending on the season. But at the same time, there was also the circus was accompanied by a great spiritual celebration. It was accompanied by the celebration of some god, some offering to fortune, or to maybe some other, like to Jupiter or something, or to Mars, whoever. And that satisfied like this other part of the human nature that we've sort of forgotten in this very materialist world, where we're not simply mind and body, we're also soul. And it's this tripartite nature of the human being that, everybody tries to ignore. Even those on the right will go to great lengths to ignore it. Like if you look at people like Jonah Goldberg and his new book, The Death of the West, and some of the rebuttals that have been written about it, it's all this idea that, man is a completely secular thing, that we never needed God. All these things can be justified through completely secular means. And as such, we just need these material factors in order to satiate people. And the left is destroying these material factors for X, Y, and Z. And, people have called him out, rightly so. I think it was an article in The Federalist that said, no, it can't be this. We have a certain illiberal foundation based on spiritual traditions and culture that's been written into us that you can't just write off. And so it's part of this thing that I think very much needs to be reinstated, is this idea that there's a spiritual component to man that has to be catered to. And I think that's what Trump and the new right is starting to get the hold of again.
Um, well, I mean, maybe not, but I mean, from the perspective of like what is the left up to and why is the left not tapping into this kind of thing which you're describing here, I think it's not necessarily because people are unable to realize that it's there, but more that there's been a timidness among many of them because they don't want to be accused by the kind of like the Ben Shapiro right of engaging in demagoguery. Really,
Yeah.
because obviously they just spent the last 8 years being accused of demagoguery, even though they were engaging in practically none of it. So it's kind of like a strange psychological conditioning which they've subjected themselves to because they've been told not to behave in these ways.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
I mean, you know, if you were to go out and stand on a platform or something and say the kind of things that Donald Trump and his supporters say, but you were to do so while not being on the right, you would immediately be accused of being Hugo Chavez or something.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The right in the neoliberal sense has chosen to completely reject the foundations it was built on in terms of the old right and this sort of spiritual legacy that not only Christianity has given it, but even like the old Roman gods sort of gave Christianity in a sense. This sort of spirit of militarism and conquer in the name of this greater objective good. It's been completely lost on them to the point where they're all essentially some sort of pseudo libertarians who want to abide by the NAP and this bastardized Kantian ethic. But none of them are all, simultaneously, they'll all deny that and claim some deep religiosity. It's one of the biggest contradictions that has come out of the right. And it's one of the things that people on the left, I think, are slowly starting to pick up. People like Slavoj Žižek are very attuned to this, but even for all his popularity, very few people are choosing to actually run with his talking points, with which I think is a shame, honestly. But Nero, you wanted to say something before? I'm sorry.
Yeah, he was waiting for
Yeah, I was
ages
going
now,
to
so
ask
I
Ray.
should not skew the next. I should not cue the next point. I should let him go first.
Hmm.
Okay, I actually wanted to ask Ray a very quick question that has to do with foreign aid, and hopefully we could start a little mini discussion about it. See, you brought up foreign aid and how giving contraception to people in African countries is good because it, and we'll probably get into this later. It helps prevent the children who would be terrorists or criminals from being born. Okay, we'll discuss this later, but here's another form of foreign aid that, and actually, I think Academic Agent made a video on this recently, like a couple of months ago, and it's actually a video I actually agree with him on. Ray, is it true that since when you subsidize something, you obviously get more of it? That's a basic law of economics. So, is it true, as
Supposedly,
many people on the right say, that if you donate food, actual food to Africa, you also
hmm.
create or subsidize procreation? Is that true?
No, no. Um, if you donate food to Africa, I mean, I don't know why we're choosing Africa specifically, but let's say Africa then. Um, if you donate food to Africa, one of two things would probably happen. The first thing that you would get, assuming that you do it in a sensible way, is you'd actually have less migration. And the reason we know this is because apparently, um,
You get less starving workers who want to
yeah,
flood
but
the country.
but no, but I mean, I want to actually use a data point here for this one. Um, you saw after 2013 when after 2013 when the Sahara migration routes started to kick in when people were crossing from the Sahara through Libya to reach Italy to enter the European Union, and that created a massive political backlash inside the European Union. As of this year, the number of people passing through the Sahara route that starts in Niger and goes through Libya has dropped from 330,000 to 1,000. Can anyone tell me why that might be? Not a
I,
rhetorical question.
no, I wouldn't. I'm sorry, I was muted, but I wouldn't be able to tell you personally. But I imagine you're going to give us the answer right now, right?
Yeah, I'm going to use an educated guess. The reason is because I think that Emmanuel Macron and someone else, one of these European powers, has actually had a conversation with the people who operate the gates in Niger that allow people to drive through these roads to get to the Sahara, to cross into Libya, to then cross into Italy, and have said to them that you're not going to be opening these gates and letting these people go through anymore, and that additionally on top of that, um, they're going to literally pay them with money to make them stop doing this.
That is an
I
interesting
think that
theory.
is
It's
why it has reduced. And the reason I'm thinking this is because the last time that we saw in the news back in 2015 a conversation with one of the governors that operates in those areas, he literally said bluntly to a Reuters camera, "Maybe if you were to give us money, we would stop."
Right.
Which was quite a blunt way for him to have put that.
So you do reject the right-wing idea that there's a correlation between feeding people in third world countries and them reproducing more. The whole subsidize something you get more of it argument.
No, if you change the mode of production and make them so that they're not primarily farmers, then they're going to have less children. Because when you're a farmer, obviously you need more children to be able to farm your farm. But if you transition to the next stage of economy, for example, have an industrial revolution in Africa, in any particular country, let's just choose a country randomly. Since we're already talking about Niger, still about Niger. So, if you were to have an industrial revolution in that country, like a proper one, instead of having almost everything is being produced outside of it, for example, then you're going to notice that the reproduction total fertility rate will drop. It will have to.
well, okay. So I'd say something to the idea that our subsidization is it's the subsidization of sub-Saharan Africa has simultaneously. It's not that it's simply funding things and keeping them in the way they are, like by making them reliant on our money so they're unable to actually move into the next stage and
Yeah,
thereby lower their
that's the
birth rates.
yeah, that's the thing that I was going to talk to you about because it's of course a wrong way to do this, which is that if you were to, for example, buy rice and then essentially just dump the rice in the location, it would mean they'd be unable to have the necessary wealth accumulation among farmers because you'd be displacing the jobs that farmers should be doing. Right? They'd
Mhm.
be unable to actually have that wealth accumulation, which would allow them to transition to the next stage. So you have to be very discerning in the way that you spend your foreign aid money.
So you'd still be in favor, though, of cutting off the types of subsidization that we have now in order so that they are forced to build the modes of production you
Yeah, you
deem
shift.
necessary in order to move into the next stage.
Yeah, you shift the way that you engage with them to a different mode. Someone has typed in the chat Jupiterian, and of course that means they're
No.
obviously talking about Emmanuel Macron, the absolute boy, right?
Yes. Oh, that's our boy. You know him. That's Rodin from the Natural Order.
Hmm. And so, yeah, speaking of the Jupiterian leader Emmanuel Macron, that's actually his plan, which is to adjust the way that aid is given out by France, so that it engenders a situation in which, how did he phrase this? Because he had a really interesting way of phrasing. He had a way of phrasing it where I think he said, creating an Africa in which Africans actually want to live in it. I think that's how he phrased it.
Yeah, I wouldn't even disagree with that because I think one of the key problems that the West is facing, and I think this is a good segue actually, is the fact that third world migration. I think, people trying to make this whole thing where Trump said because of migration, Europe is losing its European characteristics. Like those people are so obviously wrong. I'm still agape at how they even exist. But obviously, if Macron is even somewhat successful in changing the structure of African economics so that nations can rise up economically speaking and actually sustain their populations and no longer have to export them to the first world, I would see that as beneficial to all parties involved. What I would
Pretty much
question, though,
agreement. Yeah.
yeah, what I would question, however, is if subsidization of any kind is actually the best way to do it. Because what I would look to is the idea of subsidization being a harm in terms of domestic economic policy. And I think what we can find here is that whenever something is subsidized, again, it's a supply and demand thing to talk about it very basically. When you have an increased supply of something, the demand goes down, the price goes down, and so in order to continue production of it, there has to be some way that there has to be some firm or some group that's able to absorb all of these costs with a falling rate of profit that they're getting because this item is continually being cheapened. And so I
Yeah,
think
and
rather
that's
than
that is why the primary mode of engaging with them should not be aid by itself. You've got to have the trade deals in there, and you've got to have um, the intersection with China's Belt and Road, for example, or Japan's. Oh goodness! Suddenly, the name of the project has evaded me.
No, I get the idea of what you're
Quality
saying.
infrastructure, that's what it's called. Japan has the same thing, it's called quality
Yeah.
infrastructure. So you bring all of these things in, and you have obviously Europeans should engage as well in a trade fashion as well. And so you have all these things happening. It's the gaps that are left over after that engagement has taken place. It's there that you would then use your ability to supply aid. You do
Mhm.
not come in from the start and have aid be your primary mode of interaction, because then you've just ruined it.
Hmm. Now, I would this brings up I'm sorry, Nero, were you going to say something before?
Uh, if I did, I've forgotten it by now, so I apologize.
Okay, no
Um,
worries.
I was probably going to say something along the lines of if either of you were going to agree with the sentiment that by subsidizing certain countries with food, you're encouraging them to reproduce. I was going to argue that maybe, see, the problem is that this whole foreign aid debate revolves around the whole, it's like all or nothing. Like all foreign aid is bad or all foreign aid is good. But in reality, I think we should look at it on a case by case basis. Like, which foreign aid is actually good for this country and therefore benefits our national security, and which foreign aid is bad and we should avoid it or cut
Oh
back
yeah, definitely. I agree with you
on.
on that. It's not a
It
one
cannot
size
be
fits
all or
all thing.
nothing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what I was trying to say. Oh, I've already said it basically. But yes, so I was saying where basically the foreign aid should be filling in the gaps that are specific to individual countries, and not just as a kind of like a bazooka that you just fire as a continent.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one of the big areas in which the United States and Western Europe at large has largely been failing. Now, I would disagree somewhat in to get back to your larger point about the direction of history, so to speak.
Oh, actually, no,
I
do not do that yet. I'm sorry, I've got to pause you there first, because I'm sure that someone out there is actually thinking that we've only addressed one side of this migration issue, even though it came up by accident anyway. The other side of the migration issue is that even if you were to carry out that fix on that side, if you were to not make any changes in Western Europe, the United States, or any other countries in the global north, you might still end up with a scenario in which there are economic actors, capitalists, let's say, in the northern world who decide that nevertheless they actually want to invite mass migration on purpose so as to staff factories or something like this. The question would then emerge, perhaps, how would you prevent that from happening?
I
Or at
would
least,
per
how would you prevent
Free
that from happening?
trade.
I'll give you the
Free
answer,
trade.
my answer too. No, I mean
well,
other than free trade, because I mean free trade is already happening. But I mean, how would you prevent a transfer of population that you did not intend?
I think the simple answer is simply, but I think the answer is to just say that foreign labor is outlawed, and you imbue very harsh punishments on people who or on corporations
Well,
who
then you have
import
an
labor
incentive.
in any
This
faction.
is what I was expecting you would say, but then I think you have an incentives problem if you say that, because the state is already controlled by capital anyway, and so why would they pass a harsh law against themselves for a thing that they probably want to do?
Oh no, you're completely right in that sense, but I'm for a I think there needs to be a massive restructuring of the way our government works, and so that it's not based on capital interests and the interests of.
Hence you incrementally change things. So, for example, I'm going to bring in South Korea for a second here. There are some people who have speculated the reason that South Korea is having its present refugee crisis. Yeah, South Korea has a refugee crisis. Um, the reason that the refugee crisis in South Korea has gone the way that it has gone, which is that, well, they're not getting the refugees, is partly because of the way that their labor system is structured. So, let me give some examples. Um, they have a tripartite system of negotiation between labor and capital. I mean, you guys know how this thing works, right? It's called neo-cooperatism, and it means that the state sort of kind of pretends like it's acting as a mediator, but it kind of, the state is always going to lean toward business anyway. But it acts as a mediator, and labor comes up and makes its demands, and then capital comes up and makes its demands, and then one of the two parties will walk out in protest, or they'll come to some kind of agreement, right? So when you have this kind of setup, what can often happen is that labor will restrict the number of persons in order to increase its own value, obviously, right? But in order for that kind of setup to occur in Western European countries, you have to move away from individualism in order for that to happen. So I'll
Sure.
give some examples. Yeah, I'll give some examples, because people often ask, "Oh, well, it's kind of like a stereotypical thing. You're saying that South Koreans aren't individualist." Okay, so 37.5% of South Koreans think that economic equality is the most essential part of Korean democracy. 51% of South Koreans, and this is obviously polls from last year, 51% of South Koreans think that egalitarianism is more important than individualism, which is the highest score in East Asia, and 75% of South Koreans think that South Korea is already too unequal. Right, and so where am I going with this? Well, I think that the reason why Korea looks the way that it does now is because people believe those things, and the leaders have been reacting to this since about 1988 or before, causing them to enter into compromise stances which allow these tripartite institutional frameworks to keep operating. How did these happen? Why were they allowed to form this thing where unions can be a part of an institution which is connected to the government? Because obviously in the United States, you would not be allowed to do that because people would start hyperventilating, wouldn't they?
Sure.
They would. So how is it that South Korea has managed to actually do this and have it not be removed? So framework can trace its history back to before 1988, and so this is before Park Chung-hee actually staged his coup. But one of his first moves in 1961, when he actually did get in, was to abolish Syngman Rhee's FKTU unions and set up a new set of unions called FKTU. So they kept the same acronym, but it stands for something different. Can't remember. Doesn't matter. So the labor leaders who they selected to lead these unions were actually handpicked by the KCIA, and thus they were actually intelligence assets. And using the methods they had learned from Japanese fascism and from USA Magic, the occupation, they made sure that they were not enveloped by the Soviet Red Scare problem, because if all of your union leaders are actually intelligence assets of your own state, then they're probably not working for a foreign power. So they were able to skip the whole Red Scare hyperbolic thing that the United States went through, on that level at least. Because obviously South Korea still had a Red Scare, it just wasn't within their own unions that they had that Red Scare. So knowing that the Soviets weren't able to have entryism, they had union politics that was enjoying a certain level of toleration from Korean capitalism. And then by the time independent labor unions such as NCTU and KCTU emerged in the 1990s, the Soviet Union had already imploded, and so that strategic threat was gone. Very similar to how the UK Labour Party behaved after 1948 and how West Germany developed after that time as well. Because as you know, West Germany had, what's that system that they have called? I'm sure you know what it's called. It's the one's cooperative something. The thing where workers actually get to have an input into how the board works in Germany.
I can't think of it off the top of my head.
But either which way, they allowed that because, of course, they knew that it wasn't Soviets doing it or infiltrating it. And I think the reason this works out is because there's no cult of meritocracy in these places either. And so in order to get to a place where you'd be able to have workers actually acting as a barrier against mass migration schemes, you'd have to really sort of change up the way that Western Europeans and Americans think. So you'd have to embark on the entire cultural project. You really would.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm not even disagreeing with that. I just think that's what's necessary. And I think that's what we're slowly starting to see. Because one of the things that I think you retweeted at a point was this mention that there's a lot of middle class and working class Americans who are willing to foot the bill of a possibly more expensive tariff plan and more expensive economic schedule that's more nationalistic, if it means, you know, a greater sense of nationalism and a greater sense of Americans cooperating as Americans. And so I think one of the greatest assets that Donald Trump has with him is he's making collectivism, quote unquote, popular amongst the right. And this is being, you know, it's throwing the left into a massive tizzy, or at least, again, the neoliberal left in the United States into a massive tizzy, because they don't know how to handle it, because it's essentially hijacking their policies and actually implementing them, because the neoliberal left never had any intention of actually doing any of those things.
But he's driven it. Well, of course, you know that Donald Trump has driven the entire thing into a ditch anyway, because he's chosen the wrong policy. Well, of course, he's chosen the wrong policy, right? Because he's Donald Trump. So when he comes out and says that they're going to have tariffs and that they're going to have, what's the other thing that he's done? Oh, yes, he combined tax cuts with tariffs. That's what he did. Oh, and also dismantling.
What do you mean by that? I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, okay. I'll explain what Donald Trump has done and why I think it's all wrong. So the first thing he comes in and does is he's not going to sign the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as we know, right? So that's the first thing. Then he decided he was going to question NAFTA, right? After he finished doing that, he then turned around and engaged in that how did he phrase it? Was it called tax restructuring? Was
So
that
are
what they
you
called
talking
it?
about the tax bill that he got pushed through
Yeah,
Congress?
the tax bill, which I assume that Mitch McConnell found very enjoyable. And so
Hmm.
they did that, and then after they'd finished doing that, they then pivoted from that to something involving the courts. How did they manage to pull that off again?
With the courts, well, Trump's been, of course,
Oh yes,
checking some of.
they had appointed Neil Gorsuch. That was it. Sorry.
Oh yeah, the Supreme Court. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. So they appointed Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, and they've lined up this other guy Kavanaugh. Um, and also while they were at it, they dismantled a lot of labor um, rights regulations, which they did not actually talk about while they were doing it. Um, so
Hmm.
I'm not sure how that's going to result in rising wages in the U.S. Like every part of it is wrong because if they engage in tariffs, then essentially they've just driven down the sorry, they've driven up the cost of living, right? And if they engage in these massive tax cuts that they're engaging in and taking away social services from people, then that's also not pushed up the price of labor. And then if they then sabotage the ability of people to actually engage in bargaining with their employer, then that also means that they're not going to have rising wages. So
Say
at
that.
what
Say that one
point
last thing again, because you kind of roboted a little bit on my end.
okay, no, sorry. And if they also sabotage the ability of workers to negotiate with their employer for a particular wage, then there's no way, with these three things intersecting together, there's no way they're going to end up with rising wages by the time this is done.
Okay, so there's a little. Okay, with all of that taken into consideration, there's a little bit of interplay here. For one, the economic effects of the tariff have been largely, I think, exaggerated so that there's going to be a much larger footprint on like the cost of living for Americans than there actually would be. James Alsop happened to go into this a little bit in a video he did some time ago where, say, the tariff on tin would only cost about the average American like an extra cent per can or something like that. So that's not a huge
Yeah,
economic
which
footprint.
calculation
It's and
using
something
time.
like an extra maybe grand on a car, which isn't a massive deal anyway, considering most people are even hesitant to buy cars in the first place. So an extra grand isn't really a make or break type of situation with that. And that's just on the
That is
tariffs
significant.
end.
That is significant, though. I think for a working class person, an extra $1,000 is pretty significant.
No, no, no. I'm not denying it's significant, of course, depending on which social strata level you're on. But the next issue I think you brought up is a little bit more nuanced because when you look at the structure of welfare in the United States and you look at who's getting what, it can very much be it can very much be broke down by racial sort of outlines. And I think when you look at who's receiving what and who Donald Trump is sort of pandering to, or at least dog whistling to, Trump's talking about when he's talking about working class Americans, he's mostly talking about the white working class, and sometimes
Yeah.
explicitly. And when you look at who's receiving the most benefits out of welfare and social programs, it's largely a minority group, which he hasn't even won over anyway, and so was never going to vote for him. So when he talks about gutting things,
No, but then plenty of those people that he purports to care about also use programs such as Snap.
yeah, no, I'm not saying there isn't some overlap there, but at the same time,
And then also it varies depending on the state too. For example, in Kentucky, I think that greater than 70 something percent of them would have benefited significantly from the Affordable Care Act, and yet they voted for a person who's intending to not allow them to participate in the exchanges, for example.
yeah, no. Well, there's also a different attitude though amongst this white class that's on welfare. And that attitude is that they don't really want to be on welfare. They don't like this idea of receiving a handout, even if it's the thing keeping them alive. They want to go out and do work. And I think that's where the tax cuts come in. Because when you have this sort of reduction in the amount of income that's being taken, it's this idea that, all right, well, now I'm earning more by going out and actually working for myself as opposed to if I'm just sitting around getting a handout. So it's incentivizing something that the white working class actually wants, which is to go out and do work. So it's
Well,
not
this
just
sounds all very
economic ramifications.
psychological, though, given that it's not like they were getting very much to begin with. So it's kind of like they've gone from getting barely a little bit of a handout to getting less than a little bit than they had before. Like, why? How can I put this? It's kind of like sometimes I wonder if Americans are living in kind of like an alternative reality on this because everyone else is receiving more than them in other countries and they haven't imploded. For example, if you were to look at the UK system and the figures that are presently going on, UK's unemployment level has been steadily declining for at least the past 2 years, 3 years perhaps, and no one had to actually slash away entitlements in order for that to occur.
Well, I can't speak to exactly why that's happening in Britain. I'm not a major. I don't keep myself up to date on the economic conditions of the UK or even for
Never,
any part of Europe for
of
the
course, but
most
I mean,
part.
I'm asking why does that happen that way there and not so much in the United States? I mean, let's do a comparison with Japan as well. Japan's unemployment rate stubbornly will not go above 5.6%. You can't get it above 5.6% for some reason. And it doesn't seem to matter whether you give or you take or you don't or whatever. It just happens that way regardless. So I'm wondering sometimes if the way that Americans talk about this system is actually inaccurate because, I mean,
Well, I think this speaks
are
to,
Americans unique on the entire planet that they react almost in this kind of binary way to the incentive of eating versus not eating?
I think well, first off, I would say that there is a unique cultural spirit to America. But what I would say about the conditions of those other countries, specifically Japan and Europe for a very long period of time, was the certain cultural homogeneity that existed in those countries. For one thing, we know the Alt-Type has done some of the numbers on this, is that the surplus that the white working class Americans actually put into the government could possibly pay for some of the programs you're talking about that are implemented currently in the UK and Japan. However, we do not have solely a white working class. We are for better or for worse, multi-ethnic society. And as
Yeah.
such, lacking the homogeneity and the cultural unity to get behind these programs, we're in a situation in which these things can't reasonably be implemented without a lot of free riding from these different ethnic groups.
Well, I mean, to be fair, the United Kingdom is also a multi-ethnic society. The United Kingdom is 86% white British.
That's
87.
You're
sorry,
essentially
87% white British and 10% Asian and 3% 3% African or Afro-Caribbean. So that's actually pretty diverse too, though, isn't it?
I wouldn't say so at all. 80%.
So I mean, if you were to add up the people who are not white British, that's 13% basically.
Yeah, that's
You would
to
think
me
that there'd
that's
be a problem, but there isn't then.
well, no, but I wouldn't call that any sort of.
Compared to
I
the
wouldn't.
United States.
Sorry, go ahead, Nero.
I mean, compared to the United States, I don't know, because here's the thing. In the United States, whites are around. Okay, I'm quoting from memory.
We're roughly like 65% or around there.
Yeah, around 62% from what I remember. 62%.
Sure.
And blacks, and ever since 2012 to today, blacks still are only 13 to 14% of the population. And so that leaves around roughly 25% of the population being Hispanic or Asian. So essentially,
Also, I should add, while you mentioned that, the fastest growing population in the United States right now is also Asian.
Asian or Hispanic?
Well, it's a close competition, but as of this year, supposedly, Asian has won out.
Interesting. Okay. Well, the point I was going to make briefly was that when you say Britain is ethnically diverse at being 87% white, I would be very much inclined to disagree there, because if you have a supermajority of one race, or even more so in the case of England, that's pretty much that would be if you were to take the racial identity politics of the neoliberal left and look at a company that was 87% white, they would say that's horribly undiverse. And I would agree with them. I wouldn't think it's a bad thing, of course.
Well, I'll put it this way. It would be an 87% white company would be, I guess you could say, a strange looking thing, only if you were in a country in which 87% of the persons that you're talking about weren't actually 87% in terms of the actual makeup of the demographics of the entire country anyway. So, like, for instance, in the United Kingdom, if you had a country that was 87% white, I don't think that anyone would really be like, oh my goodness, how could that be? Because, I mean, obviously a rational person would look at that and be like, well, the country is in fact 87% white, so you would expect that this would happen.
Well, yeah, whereas sure. I'm not disagreeing with that.
Whereas in the United States and parts of the New World, it's completely different, because the New World is totally mixed up in the first place.
No. I get that.
Why is it an 87% white country would qualify as a ethnically diverse society? That's, of course, obviously I'm talking about the old world. By the old world standards, 87% means that something has clearly happened. Because I mean, obviously, like if you were to look at South Korea, for example, South Korea will probably never get down to 87%.
Yeah, I
I
hope
think
they don't.
I think right now it's at like 97 or something like that, right?
Mm.
And so this is one of those things where I guess you could technically say that South Korea is a multicultural society in the sense that there are 3% of people there who are not South Koreans.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I think your threshold for ethnic diversity is quite low, and that's where I would tend to disagree with you because I don't think a society which is still like I consider pre 1965 United States in which white Americans were roughly around that same percentage, around 85% white. I think that's a solidly ethnically homogenous country. I mean, of the little
Uh,
mixture that was like the 12% or the 13% of blacks, that's it's going to be there, especially considering the United States' unique history.
well,
But I
consider the
think there's a
rhetorical
larger homogeneity there when you have such a large percentage of your country being one ethnicity.
well, consider the rhetorical problem in that though. If everyone is walking around essentially, asking you almost at verbal gunpoint to basically, become as tolerant and diverse as possible, the first thing you should actually want to do is admit that you already are this thing, and that therefore you can't be pressured to do it more.
I well, I think
For example, if the kind of persons that you're talking about who are very very keen on making sure that diversity reaches everywhere always, let's say that they were to go on a tour of South Korea. Sorry for using for any Koreans out there listening for me continually using your country in this way as my example, but because I don't want to use Japan as the example. But anyway, um, so let's say they were to go to South Korea and they were to say that you've got to become more diverse or whatever. The appropriate response to that would actually be, in a political sense, to say, well, we can't do it any more than we're already doing it. We're already diverse. Don't you see? We have 3% of people who are not like us. What would they possibly have to say at that point? It's if
well,
you assert, it's if you assert that you are not doing the thing which they are asking you to do, that then people will begin to
Why
ask
don't
you
you
to
want to
do.
use Japan as an example?
Because everyone uses Japan as an example.
yeah, it's a bit
Oh yeah.
overplayed. I would
It's
agree with
it's,
that. But
it's massively overplayed.
well, no, I agree with you
I mean
that the
that.
political answer would be to claim that the current level of diversity you already have is enough diversity. But of course, the goalposts are constantly shifting with the type of people we're talking about, being that they would claim that 3% is not nearly enough, and they would continually demand more and more and more. I would,
That's when it becomes a very strange, a very strange conversation because I mean, we're here, we're talking about it, so I mean, I guess let's do it. But um, in fact, let me use Japan as the example. I should just do it. So anyway, let's talk about Japan, I guess. So if someone were to come to Japan and say that, for example, and then like expect a response from me that's not a negative response, I don't know what they could possibly expect from that question. Like,
well, I think you can.
why aren't you more diverse than you already are? It's a very strange thing. It's almost like they'd be arguing that you should not have people who look like each other gathered in one space. Like, I mean, what would be the principle that they're going for there?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the big question and I think it's largely the question that the neoliberal left has trouble answering. But I think that's exactly what the line of attack would be. You question them on why this diversity is even necessary in the first place and what's the point of it. So I think rather than say, "Oh, we're already diverse," and allow them to shift the goalposts to continually being more and more diverse, you just outright say point blank, should we even be diverse? What is the benefit to us?
Yeah, or ask both questions at once. Or yeah, ask but take both strategies at once. Because if you say that you're already diverse, that's not necessarily saying that you intended for it to be that way. It just so happened that it's that way. The question for them would be, why would they want to deliberately engineer that?
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
And
if it
so
just so happens that there's 3% of people in the country who are different from the majority, I mean, that's okay. I mean, no one's hating on them per se. I mean, if they are, perhaps then people should stop engaging in discriminatory activity, obviously, right? But there's a difference between it so happens that there are people in a country who are different from from the natives of that country, and they should be treated with respect and be afforded equal rights. And the other argument, which is that you should deliberately seek to engineer a demography which is different from the one that you have. Like,
mhm.
someone would have to give a strategic this just someone would have to give a strategic justification for that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's I think that's the point of attack that most people, or at least the intelligent people, are now beginning to pick up. And so I don't see why necessarily the idea behind claiming that, well, this level of ethnicity is already diverse enough is, a worthwhile line of attack. It's worthwhile pointing out instead that these people, by demanding it, are demanding something ridiculous if they're incapable to rationalize it, except to claim that diversity is good for diversity's sake. And so I don't, and that's why I would again disagree with your political maneuvering of saying, well, England is diverse because we have 13% of people who aren't like us. Instead, just say that, well, we are mostly homogenous, but why should we be diverse?
Well, the reason I always have a problem with using the it is homogeneous argument, right, is because if you start from the perspective of it is homogeneous and it actually really isn't, then you're essentially legitimating the idea that someone can tell you that you must integrate in order to make it so that they can say that it's homogeneous. And of course, obviously, I'm against integration because that erases and destroys the culture of the minority group. So I would never be, I would never want to acknowledge that the United Kingdom is a homogeneous country, because that would obviously be against my interest.
Yeah, well, I think now we're sort of getting into different types of homogeneity. There's cultural homogeneity, and then there's ethnic homogeneity. And usually I would say the two kind of go hand in hand, because you'll usually ethnic groups never fully integrate into the country. There's always something that's maintained, even in the United States, which is of course infamous for its whitewashing of multiple cultures with blatant consumerism. But even there's still some remnant of the host culture left. And even if it's, blanketed by consumerism, you still have these various small ethnic groups that are all sort of vying for more power within the state amongst each other, even if it's to a ostensibly polite degree. So,
Well, I'm going to do something slightly controversial here now as well, because I've been told, apparently, I had one of these trolls telling me that, I think it was 2 weeks ago or something, one of these trolls came to me in direct message on Twitter or something and told me that I am basically Barbara Lerner Spectre inverted. So of course I was like, I'm what now? So,
yeah, I'm unaware of who this person is either. So explain what the
yeah.
insult was supposed to be.
Apparently, according to the memes, apparently she is the woman who enunciated the quote that went something like, Europe is moving into a multicultural mode right now, and that this is a transformation which must take place, otherwise Europe cannot survive. That quotation, which is often used by
Oh,
far, yeah, she's that person, and apparently I'm her inverted. And so I decided, you know what, I'm going to take this on for a second. And so, thinking about this, I'm going to make the controversial viewpoint of what if that statement in and of itself is actually not offensive? If we understand multiculturalism to mean recognizing multiple cultures which are not reconcilable with each other, if someone were to say then that multiculturalism must be implemented, otherwise Europe cannot survive, that's not actually a negative statement, is it? Because it's actually just factual. Because if you were to not have multiculturalism while having multiple ethnic groups in the same location, then Europeanness would indeed not survive.
right. So hold on. What exactly was the point of that? What were you trying to
Yeah. Where am
address?
I going with this? The point that I'm trying to make with this is that there are plenty of people striding around out there, many of them on the populist right, who seem to think that multiculturalism is a bad word. This is not true. The word which people need to be looking out for is actually integration. Integration is where the destruction happens, not multiculturalism.
Okay. I see the point you're now making, and I agree and disagree, because what that would then imply is that for the sake of preserving, because I'm not, because that would mean something completely different to people on the right, because if they would, I think, agree with what you're saying, is that integration is a bad thing, you should preserve the culture of your own people. But at the same time, what they would then say is that, well, look at these people who are going to refuse to integrate because we're telling them not to integrate. Let's then just prevent them from getting in so they don't bring in their own culture and start to taint ours. It would be a case for the right to make that immigration should just be completely halted for the sake of cultural
Well, I mean,
preservation.
Well, I mean, technically, a person who is not integrated with you cannot taint your culture because they're deliberately not intersecting with it.
Shouldn't we uh, use definitions here? Right? What's your definition of multiculturalism?
Literally, what it says: multiculturalism is
Okay, so here's
the arrangement in which multiple groups adhering to different cultures are active within the same civic space.
okay. So let's apply this to Europe. Now I'm not good. I don't use this exact wording, but you do, so I'm just going to quote you. You said that you said it on a live stream with Academic Agent, and I believe you made a tweet about this like maybe a couple of days ago, but I forgot the exact date you made this tweet. But you mentioned how Muslim culture, especially in Europe, well, Muslim culture in general, but it's present in Europe. Muslim subculture is infected what you would call toxic masculinity, which would include rape culture.
Yeah, and then
So
everyone
in
got
that
mad
case,
when
would
I said it.
multiculturalism be a bad thing since you wouldn't want there to be multiple cultures, and one of those cultures it makes says that rape under certain circumstances is perfectly okay? It,
It depends on how you try to approach this. For example, if you come in and say that basically multiculturalism can happen, and you invite in a population group that has a very repugnant array of beliefs, and you do not integrate with them, then it will be discovered very quickly where it is the source of the problem is actually coming from. At which point you can then ask these people to reform their culture or otherwise face the prosecution.
Hmm. Well,
And
I'm having
so it becomes their responsibility as opposed to it becoming some kind of like
so in other words,
spread out responsibility across society.
you're not
I
necessarily opposed to
Multiculturalism does not mean you just tolerate whatever it is that happens that people happen to be doing within your civic space, but it does mean that whatever it is that's happening, you know from whence it has come.
Yeah, well, I'm catching some mentions in the chat here, and just to to read few of them out. It's having multiple irreconcilable cultures destroy social cohesion. Doesn't matter which ones they are, and I would certainly agree with that. And at the same time, that's also integration would destroy the host culture, but competing cultures in the same space also undermines the host culture and strains the polit.
yeah.
And that I would completely agree with all
Yeah,
of that.
there is a social strain that comes about from having multiple cultures in the same space. Like I'm not going to pretend that is
Yeah,
not an issue that can come
multiculturalism
up.
is especially a problem when
But I
there's
mean, if you
competing
yeah,
cultural
but I mean,
cultures.
if you're going on in terms of like order of stress level, the maximally bad thing that you can choose to do would be to have lots of people who are not from your country inside of your country, and then demand that they should integrate, and then have them actually comply with that. That's the worst of all worlds.
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
I'm saying that the worst possible thing that you could do would be to have lots of people who are not from your country being invited into your country in a case in which um, there is no space for them in the labor market, and then on top of that, to ask them to integrate and then have them actually comply with your demand.
Yeah, sure. No, I
That's the
would.
worst possible of all four worlds right there.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
that unfortunately is what lots of the mainstream sense, most of this mainstream center right seems to think that is good.
You They think it's good.
Yeah. If you okay, let me see if I can take someone as an example. Let's say you have someone who's a Trump supporter who's wearing, like, I guess you could say, one of those MAGA hats, except they're not from the part of the Trump supporters who is, sort of, the overtly racialist caricature, but rather is the kind of like, let's not have identity politics and let's everyone all get along kind of
So a
person.
Dave Rubin kind of Trump
Yeah, a
supporter.
Dave Rubin kind of person. What this person would do if you insert them into Western Europe, for example, or into East Asia, or into even South Asia, this person would simply invite everyone around them into the same civic space as them and then demand that everyone should integrate.
Hmm.
Within 50 years, you have complete disaster. That's the
Yeah,
worst possible of all worlds.
yeah, absolutely. And you're saying, right, but the people like the Dave Rubin types would think this is a good thing.
Yeah, they seem to think it's a good thing, and will actually, attack you and lecture you in various spaces, telling you that, oh, you shouldn't be engaging in identity politics because it divides people. I'm just thinking to myself, well, that's kind of the point, though.
Yeah.
Like I keep getting it. I know I'm kind of rambling off the beaten path here, going into a
Well,
direction.
It's
no,
all right. We're
I
used
think
to it.
I think this is rather revealing, only
Yeah, it's
because
a really annoying thing that I've been dealing with ever since I've been on Twitter, which is basically Americans responding to people posting about identity politics by saying that we don't like identity politics because it's allegedly divisive. To which then I end up responding 100% of the time that division is precisely the thing which I am intending to foment.
Oh yeah, definitely. And, well, the funny thing I think about this whole conversation is that this is absolutely a point somebody on, say, the alt right might make, or somebody on just the dissident right might make. Yet it's coming from somebody from somebody like you, who would describe themselves as a type of socialist. And I think this would certainly throw people for a loop, because they wouldn't understand to what end this is. Because at the same time, people
Yeah,
could
it's just
make the
it's
case.
just taking identity politics to its logical conclusion. Like this is something that sometimes when you interact with sort of regular center liberals, you start to wonder whether they really believe the things that they're saying, because
Hmm.
you often encounter liberals who are talking about, oh, everyone has to understand their sense of identity and be careful of the supremacist structures around them, but then at the same time they'll also call for integration and a complete merger between the persons who they're positing are oppositional to each other. You can't have it both ways.
Oh yeah, this is like the inner contradictions of liberalism that, again, somebody like a Zizek type is huge in pointing out. I just find it interesting because you could make the argument, and people from the neoliberal left have made the argument, or people from the neoliberal left, LARPing as true leftists, often make the claim that you could have a system which imports these third world migrants and kind of dilutes their culture to some extent, for the sake of pushing economic programs or other manifestos that would further a broadest leftist agenda through, like, reformationism, like you advocate for. So how would you respond to someone saying, well, it might be whitewashing their culture a little bit, but if it's pushing the goals of the broader left, isn't that an acceptable loss? How would you respond to something like that?
Um, if people carry out their own internal reforms to their own way of life without being blanketed with the idea of you must integrate or face some kind of intimidation aspect or something, like so long as it's not an integrationist narrative, then yes, of course, people are allowed to reform their own culture. You would hope that they would, because this is what has to happen, right? One way I would address it with them is that even inside the native countries of the persons that we're talking about, let's say we choose Pakistan for a moment here, just randomly selected a country. I didn't choose it specifically, so any Pakistanis out there listening, no, I'm not about to say something horrible about your country. But let's say we choose Pakistan at random. If Pakistan were to engage in a process of social reform, which changed very dramatically certain aspects of their culture, and they had chosen to do this through their own hand, right? Let's say that they adopted some elements of socialism and became radically changed as a consequence. That does not mean that they've been whitewashed, I don't think. That just means that Pakistani people decided they wanted to be socialists.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but what would you say? Say the whitewashing was of a broader type. Say it was this sort of uh, say it was actually say that there was, in these white first world countries, white people thought their version of socialism was the only version of socialism to be pushed, and that they were importing third world migrants solely for the sake of getting the votes to push their champagne socialism into effect, and then at the same time they're trying to whitewash the culture of these people they just imported, so they will comport better to their version of socialism. What would you tell those people?
I would tell
Because
them
I
that
think that's a very real phenomenon. Like, I think
yeah,
that's
there's a
something
little,
that's
there,
definitely
yeah, there's a
happening.
little bit of a danger in that if they're going to go about. You're essentially describing it deliberately. An integrationist left. That's what you're describing to me, right?
Well, yeah, it's assuming that an integrationalist policy is, in the sense we're talking about, is a part of the broader left agenda. You don't. I'm
Yeah,
not
I
saying
think
that's
it's
the
that
actual case. I'm just saying, for the sake of this
that if
discussion.
hypothetically someone were to attempt to do this,
Yeah.
I would of course point them to the lesson of the Soviet Union, which of course is obviously a negative lesson, which is don't do that because it's not going to work. First off, and second off, if it does work, then you've just recreated a white supremacist structure which everyone is then going to rise up and rebel against.
Hmm.
Obviously there are some pro-Soviet people out there who are now probably very angry with me for having said this, but I mean,
Who cares
I don't
about
think I'm.
tankies though?
I don't think I'm the first person to say the fact that to say that the USSR was a white supremacist structure.
Yeah, no, I don't. You certainly wouldn't be. Of course, there are people who would. I know there are plenty of people who would make the case that Slavs aren't white, but that's another discussion.
Also, the
So
People's
by the
Republic of
way,
China took that position as well. After 1991, when the whole thing imploded and they did their analysis of why it imploded, I mean, there was a lot of ink spilled on the idea that what had happened in the USSR was that they had
I need
pursued
to.
a form of integrationist narrative that never actually translated into equality among the different ethnic groups that exist in the USSR.
And
And so
Yep.
when the uprising came, which was, or I should say, when the time came that the USSR was really on its last legs, really on its last wheels, even,
Hmm.
right? It was ethnic minority groups which did the most to actually split it up after that was finished.
Yeah, no, I would
And it's
agree
because
with.
they were always placed in the lock and key, and they were always struggling to get out, and they had
I,
never managed to resolve that.
I would agree with that assessment to some extent, certainly, being that Russia isn't an ethnically homogenous thing, ethnically homogenous unit, as some people like to imagine it is at all. And on top of that, there's also the idea that what Rome did was much different than try to integrate all these various people. Rather, it gave each of the people that it's conquered its own space and its own time frame to
Exactly.
work out its own culture. Like it didn't have mass migration between the provinces that it conquered, and it didn't try to force its culture
Exactly.
upon it's the people it conquered either. Also,
Yeah.
but I think
This was something that the Ottoman Empire also attempted to do before actually reversing course and creating a disaster. It could be argued that the Ottoman Empire could actually have survived for longer if it had maintained the appropriate space between the different groups within it.
sure, yeah, all right. So I think that's a good. We'll just end the conversation there briefly because Nero wants us to talk about probably what our biggest contention might possibly be, and that is this.
yeah, I apologize. I don't have much time.
No, no, no. It's not a problem because we did say we'd get to it. It was the issue of
Yeah.
abortion and overpopulation and population control in the third world. So I know
Oh
Ray.
yeah, everyone hates me for the points that I make. I am telling you, I've
I
got
feel
people
you.
whining at me still now about how can you possibly believe that that abortion should be legal from the time of the beginning of the pregnancy right up until the day of the birth. Like literally, like you can have abortion like any time is my position, and so everyone is really pissed off with me because of that for some
Hmm.
reason.
Yes, well, I would certain.
Even if you have some kind of like moral objection to this, I'm not sure why you would be so obsessed over the specific time at which it occurs. Because either which way, like even if you're opposed to abortion, does it really matter at which stage that it happens?
I mean, I
Oh no,
think
yeah,
we need to draw a
you
distinction between legality and morality, because legality should be focused more on the practical aspect of stabilizing a society, while morality, let's be honest, if you have 10 people of different on all across the political spectrum discussing what morality is, even if you got PhD philosophers who subscribe to different political ideologies, if you got them all in one room to discuss what morality is, you would have like thousands of different opinions. In my view, morality is basically dependent on the person, but there is definitely ethical systems that you should go for when trying to formulate public policy. Ray, do you
okay?
agree with that? I remember you said something about how you don't believe morals exist.
At least not in the way that people usually conceive of them. Like I don't believe there's some moral structure that exists prior to our thinking of it.
All right, so this is going to be a point of contention then immediately because in the context of abortion, Ray, what you said was completely right in that it shouldn't matter when exactly the abortion is happening if you're killing a life, and I would agree as someone who is ardently pro-life as a Catholic as well. It's like abortion at all stages ought to be completely illegal as opposed to completely legal. But I would also say that it's not simply based on my personal standing on the matter. I would say that there is an objective moral framework that exists outside of our being and existed prior to our being, even.
Well, I think I know who you're referring to. You're saying it's Jehovah, right?
Well, I wouldn't call him Jehovah personally. I like the more philosophical terminology of logos specifically. Now, I have a very loose understanding of logos as I'm still sort of getting into Thomism and even some of its basis in Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism. But my understanding of logos is that it's this idea of to put it bluntly, it's the unmoved mover, it's the cause, it's the first cause without a cause, and it's this eternal source of truth and right and goodness from which all other forms of truth and goodness and rightness spring. And so,
Well, the
yes, I
question.
would say that is my moral framework coming from logos.
Okay, well, the question I put to you is this then. If we're talking about logos, I mean, the logos you're talking about here almost sounds like it's kind of like the pristine reality, the ground, which you find in Buddhism.
Mhm.
If this is what we're actually talking about, then wouldn't that be the least caring being that could possibly exist? I
No.
mean,
What?
if it's pristine reality, it's basically it's almost like nihilism codified. Why would it actually care as to whether you're aborting a fetus?
Because we are specific dividends of his creation. Like, there is a reason for our being. Like, there's a reason for the universe's being. It simply doesn't exist because logos exists. The specific way in which it exists is because he willed it to be that way, in a demonstration of not simply his power but also his love for his creations. And that love extends to everything he's created and all the life
Okay,
he's
would you
created from
would you
conception to death.
would you agree then? Well, obviously, if you don't agree, then it's different. But I'm assuming you probably will agree. Would you agree then that, let's say, the creator, and I'm putting this in giant quotation marks here,
Mm-hmm.
right? Would you say that the creator, quote unquote, is attempting to get to know itself through humanity?
No. I know where you're kind of going with it, and it's this kind of Hegelian spin of, the creator created itself and alienated from itself in order to get it to know itself and complete the dialectic, that kind of thing. I know
Yeah, it's
what.
kind of like Gnosticism meets meets Hegel.
Yeah, no, I've been reading specifically about this, and I disagree with him there. I disagree in very fine points with Hegel's conception of the absolute and what logos is. Although I think there's a fair amount of overlap, and I think it'd be an interesting line to develop. What I We aren't necessary to so God can get a greater understanding of himself. He is all that is and all that ever could be. And so our creation is less an act of him is not at all an act of him knowing himself, but rather an act of him showing his love and desiring to bring creation in life so that we can partake in him. It's almost like, again, he doesn't need us, but he wants to be more than he doesn't want to be alone almost. It's
Okay,
a horrible way to put it, but it's something
so
along those lines.
I'll give you another little bit of a test here. What if I told you the statement, and let's say that this statement was being said by a god, for example, perhaps the god you're talking about. Let's just say for a second. Would you agree with the statement if this god were to utter the statement, wherever there is power and wherever there is beauty, therein there's a fragment of myself?
Yeah, I would agree with that statement.
Aha, okay. So, do you think there's power and beauty in a blastocyst?
Power and beauty and a blastocyst.
Yeah, like, or is that
Uh,
just like some kind of like irrelevant thing which can be discarded? Because of course my argument is going to be that does anyone even notice when you destroy a blastocyst or
I
a
would.
zygote or a fetus?
There may not be power, but I certainly believe there is a certain beauty to it. But even more so than that, I would believe it's partaking in the form of the logos's goodness and greatness, in the form of simply its existence. Like, this is a thing that has not existed, that came into being not simply out of its own will, but for the purpose of partaking in what the logos foredestined it to take part of, which is itself, and
Okay,
eventually
well
to
here's
return to logos upon its death. So it's not simply a
okay.
matter of just whether it's partaking in the fullness of the form of which logos aspires it to pertain to, but it's slowly getting there, at least.
Okay. So this is a question I've obviously put to many Catholics and Muslims, probably mostly Muslims, but I'm just going to give it to you anyway. Um, do you think that these things really have the kind of value that you're attaching to them, because I mean you're essentially saying that God has assigned a particular value to these zygotes, basically, that are going to become something else, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think these things really have this value if, let's say, hypothetically, 60% of them are automatically destroyed already?
Sure. No, they still have just as much value. There may
Okay, so
be.
then why on earth then? Okay, this is the question which I've always been asking. Why on earth then, if you believe that God is actually concerned with the reproductive systems of random women on the planet, why would God simultaneously make these reproductive systems such incredible death factories? Given that, what is it? I think is it 53% of zygotes will die. So I mean, nature is already carrying out half that job. If they were that valuable, they wouldn't just be automatically dying, would they?
Well, no. Sometimes in the process of our creation, we didn't have. The early Bible describes the fall from grace by Adam and Eve, and obviously that's not a literal thing that happened. There were at some point the first two humans, but it's meant to describe the state in which we exist that is imperfect. It is this material plane. It's our fall from being pure form, you might say, in Platonic terms, to being material. It sort of represents that divide between what we should be and what we ought to be. And in that process of going from form to real, there is some disjunction. And so while God has a form for every zygote and what it should be, so to speak, and what it
Really?
could... sorry?
No, I have to interject there. How can that be the case? Because that would mean that in each case where someone attempts to get pregnant but it doesn't take, which is a ton of them, right? In
Mhm.
each one of these, you'd be arguing that that was going to actually be a real person who was going to actually have a soul.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
you actually believe that the soul is imparted to the person, that with a person, I put this in quotation marks, that a soul is imparted, which creates a person in a metaphysical sense at the moment that sperm and egg touch each other. You think that's what's happening?
Well, it's imparted to them in the physical sense because the soul is this immaterial, timeless thing
Yeah, no, but
that
I'm saying
existed before their birth and
yes,
will
but I'm
exist
asking you,
after.
do you think that comes into existence at that point, or do you think that it already pre-existed?
No, it's odd because heaven and the world of forms and these things like this are timeless. So you could say that, we've in the same time where we only exist a finite we only have a finite period on this earth. We've
Hmm.
existed forever in terms of, heaven, because God created all of us. He exists outside of time. Our souls exist outside of time and being and things like that. So the soul was there, and it was imparted onto the body imparted onto the physical form at the moment of conception. And as you say, it might only have that brief stint on earth, and then it was just back to being a timeless soul again.
But if that's happening so often, okay, well, I've got multiple questions here, actually. Multiple questions, but it's all slightly different. Um, okay, so those two options that I just presented, there's also the third option, which is that the soul is endowed a number of days after birth, for example. Like in Judaism, I've heard that that they consider that the soul does not come into effect until 8 days after the birth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but obviously you're not talking about that. I'm just putting that on the table. Um,
Yeah,
in
no, I
terms
think...
of in terms of your belief that it comes before, because these things always existed and each individual always existed, and it was
Mhm.
somehow destined to be alive. If that were the case, then why wouldn't this play out similar to certain other religions of the East, in which if the zygote is destroyed and the life returns back to the pool from whence it came, would it not simply be decanted into another one?
No, because soul is, while it is a unique and timeless thing, that's not implicitly sort of connected in the way we would think of it. Like, our finger is connected to our body. Our body is almost, in a sense, the shadow of our soul. It's an odd metaphor, but just roll with me here for a second. So,
Okay, well now
God...
hold on, pause for a second because the people in the chat are slightly confused. Um, Christy Santiago, who is trying to run out of the chat. The reason that I'm asking these questions is because I'm trying to get to the bottom of how this structure that he's talking about works. So anyway, continue.
So, if we think of in the beginning, again, to refer to the Bible, we talk about there being light before the creation of the sun. Well, that light was God. It's logos. It's his eternal being. And what happens is this form takes part in some of this light. And the space it leaves, or so to speak, is sort of like our body. It's our physical representation of us. And so the body is connected to the soul in the same way the shadow is connected to us. It's not really connected to us, but it's essentially a rough approximation of us in the shadow of this.
I get what you're saying here, that the physical form of the person is actually inextricably connected to that particular soul.
Yes.
Okay, but then I'm still poking for holes here. Right? How do you then rationalize spirit possession? Sorry, not spirit possession. I should probably not use that terminology. That's a very prejudicial terminology. Overshadowing, because that's the correct term. So how do you tackle the issue of overshadowing, which is like, if you call up a spirit and it temporarily occupies your body? How is that possible then, by your logic?
Are you talking about demonic possession, sort of?
I don't know what you want to call it. It could be your guardian angel.
Well, okay. Well, angels.
How is that allowed or possible then under the system you just described?
Demonic possession is something that occurs when it's not a possession of the body. It's not a removal of the soul from the body, so to speak. The soul is still there. What happens here is that it's in the same way, how your shadow can be obscured depending on how far away you are from the light, the angle of the light. There's all these different little things that to just sort of roll with this metaphor, even though it's a little bit weird. That's kind of the thing that's happening with demonic possession. If you're dabbling in the demonic arts, presumably you're quite far away from the love of God's light and things like that. And so even though your physical body is still the shadow of this perfect soul that God wants to embrace, your body isn't really living up to it. To sort of paraphrase, the soul is willing, but the flesh is weak. And so what's
logic though? Yes, maybe I'm using the wrong example here. Okay, so I get what you're saying there. Or at least I get what you're saying there. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I do get what you're saying there. So if we go to the other side of it then and say, let's say that you have someone who is, a great preacher or something, and this person has, I don't know. Well, preachers aren't allowed to channel angels, though, are they?
No, you don't.
That's not allowed. Preachers don't do spirit channeling.
Different levels of spiritual hierarchy.
Okay. So let's say the preacher that we're talking about allows the Holy Spirit to fall on them, for example. I think that's probably the correct phraseology for this. How do you rationalize that in the system that you've just described?
Well, the Holy Spirit being part of God is just being closer to his divine light. And so what's happening there is you're not really possessed by the Holy Spirit in the idea of you're possessed by like a demon.
Sounds like an exception making here, right?
No. It's not an exception. It's an influence of the soul. It's this coming over that the Holy Spirit does in, say, scenes like the Pentecost or with certain prophets like John the Baptist. It's instances of God influencing the form of the soul so that we are more closely connected with our own form that is trying to be idealized, as opposed to being further away from it. It's like he's kind of like pushing us together a little bit. It's not an overriding of our nature. It's just it's bringing us closer to unison with it.
Okay. Actually, yeah, that's okay. Fair enough. So in this case,
I am being asked by someone very quickly to try and make what could be considered a secular argument against abortion. And
of course, we're going to get to that. I'm not going to let you not make a secular argument, obviously, because I fully intend to make sure that happens too. But so what you're saying here then is that since you believe that one soul and one body have to be matched together, that if people were to just go around essentially, whacking fetuses, as it were, removing them from existence, that in the system you're describing, it does not mean that soul then comes back into a different fetus, one that someone probably wants instead. So you're saying that does not happen?
No, there is no possibility to transfer souls into different bodies or things like that.
So, okay. By your own logic with this, I know I'm asking so many of these questions, but by your own logic, how does the system of allocation work then? Let's say that your God has a finite number of souls that are being sort of sent out into the world. All of the ones that don't actually take then, what does he do with them? Because these
Uh,
people have never lived as actual people then.
yeah, no, the teaching on that now is because that's a good question because it's often asked about, well, what happens to babies who die before they're baptized? It's a kind of a question along those lines. And the teaching
No,
of it
but even
now is
even
that,
they have no, but even they have lived. I'm talking about the ones that in your logic are apparently not getting to live because of the fact that you believe that abortion is actually killing them.
yeah,
What
well,
happened?
it's sort of a similar circumstance because the thing is here that they haven't really formed as moral agents, and so because they've taken part in no actions that are either morally good or bad, what is God going to do with them? And the a teaching that has come to be accepted by the Catholic Church is that God's love is infinite in that he would show mercy on his creations, and even though they haven't lived and haven't really formed as people, God they would be in some sort of state of purity and he would allow them to continue to take part in his love in heaven. So it'd be like, they'd be created, and even if they don't have like the life of, say, that they should have because of, maybe it didn't take, or maybe they were aborted, something along those lines, you're reaccepted into the kingdom of heaven because of God's forgiveness.
Okay, well, by that logic, then I would mean almost, sort of ever since the dawn of time, then you'd say that basically the amount of people that would be being admitted to heaven each year would be precisely half the amount of the number of people who are actually born.
That could be quite possibly true. I wouldn't object to something like that. That would be, it would be in
That would
accordance with what I understand to be God's mercy.
that would be a very weird heaven that you'd be describing there, though, because it would mean at least a quarter of the population. No, 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 because I keep forgetting that there's lots of people who won't be getting there according to your logic. But let's put it this way: there'd be a large segment of the number of people in the paradise that you're describing that would never have lived on Earth.
Right, but
Perhaps
also,
perhaps the majority, in fact, perhaps the majority of people there would not have ever lived on Earth then, because of the fact that if the system you're describing involves a salvation, and let's say about 30% of the world's population attains the salvation in compliance with the system you all have described, you, but at the same time, 53% of the zygotes that are destroyed are automatically incarnated in heaven. It would mean that you would actually have more people in heaven who have never lived on Earth than people who have.
this is slightly off topic, but
No, but really, yeah, I want to
Greg,
hear
go
that.
ahead.
But I actually want to hear that addressed by a Christian, though. What happens if you actually have more people in heaven who have never lived on Earth than actually have?
Well, it'd presumably be something like that anyway, if you account for some of the angelic hosts that would be there. I mean, we have no idea what their numbers are in, and so they've always resided in heaven and never been on Earth, too. So I don't think it would be that radically different, and I don't see why it would be such a huge deal if it's all
Yeah, but I
just,
mean, they
at the
would be.
end of the day, pure
No, I
soul.
mean, they're apparently
But
human, right?
Sorry?
No, I mean, they would be humans in this case, not like the angels. They'd be people who hypothetically would have been able to experience the same things that you're talking about, except they're just instantly created as human, but in heaven.
Yeah, no, I guess it could possibly be a weird scenario, but this is sort of a very human and materialist conception of heaven you're talking about, where it's like you're thinking that you'd interact with people in some sort of like humanly fashion as we do on here, or there'd be some sort of like interpersonal exchange and
didn't
some sort of like relationship like there would be on Earth, when in reality it's something totally beyond our
Hmm.
understanding because it's perfect communion with logos, which is something we can't even comprehend on the material world.
Okay, we're gonna
didn't
make the
Jesus
secular
ever
connection now. No, go
hold
on.
on?
No, go on. Sorry.
No,
Say it again.
yeah, didn't Jesus once say in the New Testament that every person in heaven will resemble 33 years of age? If that's the case, then it's hard to imagine these zygotes and these fetuses when they're aborted and they go to heaven that they're suddenly 33. Like, would they be able to speak? Like, what would they even look like
How
when
would they have
they?
grown up? What would
Yeah,
their
how would they?
experiences be? How would they be socialized? It's extremely difficult to imagine this.
I mean, they would awake as 33-year-olds.
Well, again, I'm not sure of the exact quote you're referring to. I'd have to look it up for myself. But
I'll try to find it.
well, yeah, but like, again, this is sort of this weird human conception of what heaven would be like, where there's socialization and there's interaction and there's language, when in reality there'd probably be absolutely none of that, because you're in the eternal presence of eternally present in the raw forms of goodness and truth and light and justice, and you wouldn't need any of these things in the first place, because when you're connected to those eternal sources of goodness, it's like, why even bother with socialization and these other souls?
Well, it sounds like what you're describing is almost like the world of consciousness or something. But at the same time, when you look in Revelation in the Bible, for example, they seem to describe it as though anthropomorphic things are occurring. For example, when they talk about kneeling at the throne and all these other kinds of things like this, it does give you the impression that they actually mean physical activity will be occurring.
Yeah, no. Okay, so the Book of Revelation is a whole can of worms that I think Protestants have sort of run away with here a bit. But to put it briefly, Revelations usually isn't this. It's not simply meant to be a prefigurement of what heaven is. It's really more so meant to describe the mass, but what it's describing is the act of the mass and the act of Christ being personified on earth in the form of the Eucharist and things like that. But even in heaven, even to describe heaven, we need some of these anthropomorphizations, just because, again, we can't comprehend it ourselves. So just because we use these anthropomorphizations doesn't mean they're as accurate as we think we are. They're just our best approximations.
Okay, well, I have to make it back to the secular connection.
Mm-hmm.
Now I have a question, which is obviously going to be an annoying question, but I'm going to ask for a chronology for the time period in which they developed the theory that you just described to me, because I want to know whether they suddenly decided that the spiritual world worked in this way specifically after the technology called abortion was created, so that they could argue against abortion using it.
No, the idea of this idea of abortion as modern abortion is very recent, obviously, but the idea of abortion is obviously uh, the idea of abortion has existed for some time. There were multiple methods of, through drink or through some sort of bodily harm to the woman and her early stages of pregnancies that were always meant to abort the baby. And the church the church organized this argument around the time when those were, as those were occurring. Obviously, it's updated its arguments as certain technologies has evolved.
There you go. This seems rather suspicious to me, because I bet you that if we were to go backwards to the time of the Catholic princes in Europe, just after the Dark Age had entered its not so just after the Dark Age, sorry, just after the Black Plague had finished, sort of taking its toll, and they needed more peasants to farm the land. I bet you that there is actually a one-to-one correlation between numbers of Catholic princes who had insufficient labor and numbers of Catholic princes who suddenly decided they were pro-life.
Yeah, I would. Well, it wasn't a matter of Catholic princes. It was never a matter of Catholic princes, really. That sort of Cesaro-papism that isn't really endorsed by the Catholic Church. And what it's really kind of come down to is, obviously, there's been changes in moral theory. I don't deny that. St. Thomas Aquinas himself actually thought that the soul didn't enter the baby until about the second or third trimester. But just because a theory on the morality of a certain action changes over time to account for new discoveries or new types of thought, that doesn't make it any less true. It just means that we've had to account for new information and new ways of arguing. It's not that it's relative. It's just that we've been updated on our understanding as fallible creatures.
I suppose, but some of these also contradict things which are written in the book. For example, and someone correct me if I'm wrong here, but I am pretty sure that there's a mention in the first part of one of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, where there is a woman who drinks something that they call bitter water or something, which causes her pregnancy to automatically abort itself. And that was permitted.
I would have to look up the circumstances, and I'd have to look up that verse because I've never heard anything like that,
Yeah,
honestly.
I mean, I could be wrong. So I'm open to being wrong on this because that could be something that is actually not from there that has kind of infiltrated its way into my memory. There's another argument which can be made as well, which is that if you look in the Old Testament in Leviticus, I think it is, and you look up the punishments that they enacted at that time. So I guess I'm arguing on your terms, but because obviously I don't actually believe any of the contents of Leviticus, of course. But I'm just saying that let's hypothetically say that we were to obey this. If you looked at the punishments that they enact for different things, the punishment that they have for murder, for example, is actually different from the punishment that happens if you were to take a stick and hit a pregnant woman's stomach with it, which cause an abortion to occur. The punishment is dramatically different. If you kill someone, apparently according to Leviticus, that's life for a life, etc., right?
Hmm.
However, if you were to actually commit violence against someone who is pregnant and that person were to lose the fetus as a consequence of it, your punishment is something like one of those property damages punishments where you have to pay the person a certain amount of money. Why would that be so if they believed that these things were persons?
Well, again, I think it's a matter of the understanding changing. I think there very might as well have been a point in time where we didn't think of it as a person because we didn't understand the process that was happening within the within the woman at that time and how it was being or arranged. Like what exactly makes the
No,
process
no, but,
something in life.
no, but think about it this way: if that is Leviticus, which is the tribe of Levi, of which apparently Moses is, prancing around during this time period, saying that he has a direct line channel to God, who is handing down laws to him and stuff like this, how would they have been able to come to a conclusion where the punishment for these two things is dramatically different? Because by the logic, you should say that well, God Himself must have known and would have informed Moses of that fact, and then they wouldn't have been able to generate laws that are divergent in that way.
Well, I think the answer to the question is sort of in there. I think the problem is Moses, and I think the problem is the fallible creatures that God created to instill His morals in. I don't think Moses maybe Moses having a direct line to God doesn't mean Moses is going to get exactly what God says right. Because again, this is the divine source of X, Y, and Z trying to talk to a mere finite material creature. And so Moses could very easily have screwed some things up in the process.
Hmm. Well, well, you can understand though. I mean, tell me if this is tell me if this is far fetched, but you can understand why secular people might look at this and think that you guys have adjusted this gradually in order to make sure that women are saddled with fetuses they don't want.
I could understand that view of it, as cynical as I think it is. I Again, of course, I think it would be wrong, but yeah, I can understand it. I think there's more nuance to it than that, obviously.
Right.
Also, the other thing is that it creates an ownership problem as well. That if you were to say that God somehow has ownership over everything, right, and demands that you're not allowed to carry out certain actions with your own property, then to what extent does anyone own any part of themselves? First question. And second question, to what extent are you able to define or decide the future of your own bloodline if you're not allowed to use abortion? I mean,
Well,
just on principle.
you can choose to not raise the child. Obviously, you have
No, but
options
you
for.
still propagated it into the world with a genetic recombination that you didn't want to have occur in the first place. So someone else has been able to essentially free ride on the genes you didn't want to share with them
Yeah,
to create a vehicle which will take their selfish genes into the world.
yeah, and you could
And of
argue
course,
that.
this is exceptionally aggravating in the case of sexual assault. For example,
No,
I'm sure you've seen the migration crisis in Germany and just how incredibly ridiculous it is, right? Would you argue that none of the persons involved in those assaults should be able to get an abortion?
well, yeah, I would because it's not the fault of that child that they happen
Okay,
to
well then
have the
by
genetics of a pretty shitty person.
okay, so then by your logic, then it just means that Arabs are getting to essentially free ride. Arab males who have been complete losers are allowed to free ride their genes on German women because
No, I get what you're saying, and I mean, yeah, it's a shitty situation for sure, where this free riding of a very violent nature occurs. But of course, we try to mitigate it as often as it happens. But I don't think that this free riding means that the life that was created from it is any less valuable than a life that was created in a consensual manner. It's still a life one way or another, even if it's created in a very violent and inconsensual or unconsensual act.
Okay, but you can see the principle that I'm actually getting at here, though, which is that then
Yeah, free
bloodlines
riding is a problem no matter how it's done.
and that bloodlines would then mean nothing then, because if every single possible potential fetus is equally valuable, then what is the purpose of making these selections?
Well, they all have the same moral worth. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's different kinds of worth. And I think the moral worth that's implied by being a child of God and having a soul and X, Y, and Z isn't the same as the worth something has in you in terms of, like, say, a personal consideration.
No. I'm not even talking about actual material, the material process of the person actually being created at this point. I mean, in terms of when I say potential child, I mean, out of all of the millions of potential recombinations that you could have, some of them being ones of your own selection, which then result in pregnancy, which then result in birth, baby, assuming that nothing happens. By your logic, none of these are inherently worse than another one.
Oh, hold on. You roboted a little bit there again for me. Just
Yeah,
repeat that
I'll
last
say
part.
again. You're saying that inherently none of these things are worse than any of the others, that they're all equal.
Hmm. Yeah, well,
Like
again,
the child of basically your, I hate to put it this crudely, but it's almost like you're saying that a child that you deliberately intended to conceive and which is the furtherance of your whatever projects your family might be on is literally just as good as a rape baby.
yeah, well, when I say these things, when I say it's just as good morally, all that really entails of it is that it's entitled, not to be murdered. It's entitled to, try and make it for itself. It's really entitlements in the sort of negative right sense. It doesn't imply that, you owe it anything necessarily other than, like, the chance to go out and live its potential. But I don't think that this idea of, it was created badly, therefore it should be destroyed. I think that's, you could make that case about, well, if the furtherance of your own project happens to be one that, through no fault of your own, ends up coming off with some genetic malfect or of some kind. If it's not like you're this perfect vessel of your own project, it doesn't mean you get to destroy it. It's still your project, and it's still worthy of the same moral considerations.
Okay, so okay, that's actually a new question then. What do you do about fetuses if you know that the fetus has some problem with it? And let's make it worse. Let's make it your first child, because then it's the one that the rest of your family is waiting on you to basically do this thing. And then the first one that you decide to create has some glitch going on with it. Now, obviously, in the culture that I come from, you press the reset button immediately and you cancel that thing. Okay. Now, what do you do? Do you essentially deliberately, on purpose, give birth to a defective fetus and then waste significant resources trying to make it perform at a level that it's not going to be capable of performing at, and then have it be your first child, so that it has to be the one that gets most of the stuff in your will? Is that how you would do this?
No, you can, like I've said before, there's the option for adoption nowadays, and I think it's an option that ought to be used quite frequently if you're not willing
No,
to
I
raise
mean, if
that type
you
of child.
but if you weren't going to take care of it, why would you assume that someone else is going to?
Because certain people have certain amounts of love in their hearts. They aren't able to conceive children themselves, so they'll take what they can get. I mean, there's a
Also,
lot
it
of
still
different
mean,
options.
well, there's the other thing as well. It would still mean that you have to go through the metabolic cost, by the way. Well, not you, but obviously the woman involved, let's say. The woman involved still has to go through the metabolic cost involved in actually carrying this thing, which is known to be damaged, to term. And there's also the risk involved in childbirth in the first place, because obviously that's the most risky time that you can be doing anything, right? So there's a possibility that you might not actually be able to give birth to more after that, because there's always a possibility that you will die within the 9 months, or there's a possibility you will die at the ninth month, for example. These are risks that you're essentially asking this person to take, and time which the person can actually be getting pregnant with a new fetus that you're essentially telling them to completely waste so that they can then offer the child up for adoption. Why? And also, I see someone in the chat has asked who is going to adopt migrant rape babies, and how does their existence benefit society?
Yes, I too have seen that comment. And
So I mean, I'm just bundling all these questions together. Explain this.
well, it's because human life isn't simply a matter of cost and benefit and does it benefit this end, does it benefit that end. Life is precious in its own sake because it is life, because it is imbued with that piece of logos and it is created with that form in mind. It's really almost irrelevant to talk about the costs of it to not only the individual giving birth, but the society at large, because this is life. This is humanity. And if
This
we
is
decide to start
sort of getting
making
into
decisions on which humans are and aren't going to live in our society based on cost benefit analysis, I don't foresee good things coming out of such a scenario.
Okay, well let me put it to you another
yeah, but
way.
this is getting into
Wealth
the
constraints. Wealth constraints as well. Let's say that you know that you can only afford to have two children, for example. Do you really want to? I mean, if you knew that there was something wrong with a fetus, would you really want to risk that one out of two of those is going to be a dud?
Well, again,
I mean, you only
I
get two.
don't.
If you
What
only get two chances, you want to make sure that you want to make sure you don't actually go wrong on the first one at
Ray.
least.
The problem with this though is that he just what he was getting into was the humanity of the fetus. And that goes into the practicality of abortion that I wanted to get into before my time is up,
Okay,
unfortunately.
no, go on.
The thing is, me and Ray discussed this before the live stream. I was having this discussion with a conservative who compared a fetus to a person in a coma, in the sense that both display a sort of a parasitic characteristics. But I think Ray could easily argue the difference, and the difference being is I wouldn't use the term invade, but let me put it to you this way before Ray goes on to defend the fetus argument. You have the right to move around your arms, correct? Well, the thing is, if you use your arms to slap Ray in the face, well, guess what? You lose your right to freely move around your arms because you violated someone else's rights. Your rights end where mine begin. So, in a sense, if a woman has the right to bodily integrity and has the right to remove that she considers to be harmful to her well being, especially if it has parasitic characteristics, as Ray will get into, then wouldn't her rights as a mother, removing the thing that she considers to be harmful to her, trump the rights of the fetus, since the fetus is technically violating her rights as a mother? I'm
No.
tired. I didn't word that correctly, I don't believe, but Ray, do you want to carry on
Yeah,
for
it's the hostile invader argument, isn't it? The one where the hostile invader is pursuing you and you decide to destroy it.
Yeah, but a fetus is not a hostile invader. Parasites, specifically, if we're going to refer to it as that, don't have whole organ systems based in within human biology in order to propagate them. So, very clearly, this isn't a parasite. And another thing I would add to that is that a fetus isn't a hostile invader. A fetus is something that pretty much has to happen through some process by which you know, a natural biological act, even if it was forced upon someone. So it doesn't just happen. It doesn't just come about and pursue you. There's, an understanding of when people engage in a certain type of activity, there's going to be a certain result. And to negate this natural result, which has the product of being, something as important as a life, for the sake of saying, well, it's uncomfortable to me, is, it doesn't fly. It's you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't engage in something and the consequence and not accept the consequences of it. Now I know this sort of changes in the case of rape, obviously, where it's like, well, this person didn't choose to engage in this whatsoever, and it was really forced upon them. So therefore, doesn't it change a little bit? But again, it comes down to the fact that even though this is forced upon you and it's very unfortunate that it was, it's still a life, and its unique metaphysical properties go
Yeah, okay,
beyond
so I do
just
believe.
that of something that is deciding whether or not it's convenient or not for you to have.
Well, then you can understand why this conflicts with both a racial worldview and it also conflicts with the clan-based worldview as well. And the reason for this is quite obvious. Let's say that you have the worst of all worlds and you have a situation in which people are committing genocide against you, but they are doing this through sexual assault, right? By your logic, then, these people must accept their own genocide. Is that what that's what you'd be arguing? Because
Well,
they
no,
would have
because
to
I
give
think you
birth to
should.
they would have to give birth to the rape babies of their enemies.
Sure, but one, I don't think you have, again, no, I think there's a lot of things you can do with these children besides simply just, chuck them to the curb and let them die. I think there are other humane
Well, no, I
options
mean
for them to be
there's a
treated.
real world example of this problem though. The thing with ISIL attacking the Yazidi, for example.
Well, no, what obviously
What were they
one
supposed to do? Because they only have a limited. The thing about this is a resources-based problem, which is they only have a limited number of resources that they can invest in children. And so, if you max out their resource investments with basically cuckoo birds, right? What are they supposed to do in terms of their actual children that they would have had if someone hadn't actually filled them up with filled up their civilization with children that they weren't supposed to have?
you have to make do. I mean, it's
There's
again,
no nationals. So basically, you're saying that the principles of basically humanitarian love outweigh survival of a race.
well, obviously, I don't think people. I think you're
Like think
implying
of
that rape could
because
happen
and the
on that
reason I ask
massive
this
of
is
a
because think about
scale.
it this way. The reason I ask it this way, even though it's very provocative to ask it this way, is because think about it this way: if these were not fetuses inside wombs and instead were actually grown human beings who were invading a land physically by crossing its borders, you tell me that what you do is you bust a cap in them. Why is it suddenly different if that thing is inside of a womb, unwanted? If
Because they
someone
didn't,
crossing a border
because
can be just shot in the face, then what's the difference?
because that child didn't decide to cross a border. It did not choose to exist. It had unfortunately existed in a negative circumstance in the way it did. There's a
Like,
difference between the person hopping the border and the child that just happened to be born across the border, in that there is an action that's actually taken place. Now, obviously, I think you
no, it's
can.
just a difference. It's just a difference in the number of steps that took place. For example, if ISIL
Well,
aggressively
no, it's
crosses
a
a border
positive action.
and commits sexual assault, then two actions have occurred. Whereas if ISIL just crosses the border and doesn't commit sexual assault, then it's only one action. But in either case, if you're willing to actually shoot this person because they're invading your border, then why are you suddenly incapable of shooting the offspring of that person if they illegally place them inside of a womb?
Okay, repeat that again. I'm sorry, I missed that.
Okay, I'll say it again. If if you're willing to shoot at ISIL when they aggressively cross your border without permission for the purpose of fighting against you,
Hmm.
then why would you not extend that same shooting, quote unquote, behavior to rape fetuses which are inside of the wombs of people which they may have encountered during the process of them invading your borders?
Because you're punishing a human that didn't do anything wrong. You shouldn't punish the
No, but I
rapist
mean, you do
for
that
what the
all the
rapist
time, though.
did.
What is collateral damage? I mean, we did Afghanistan and there was collateral damage. Are we responsible for all collateral damage that occurred due to invading Afghanistan?
Well, we are, for one, but I think that's a different argument, because one is, again, people who attacked us and us responding defensively versus a woman who was raped, unfortunately, and then killing someone who's completely unrelated when it's completely in
But
her
they
power
are
not to do
related. They
so.
are the literal descent. They are the literal genetic descendants of the person who is invading. So it's not like they're
Okay,
totally
but they
not
didn't
doing
ask.
this.
They
They
didn't
are
ask
actually
for
they
that.
are actually the progeny of the person who is doing the action.
Sure, but they didn't ask for that. You could make the case that the people who are harboring Taliban, even if they are civilians or whoever else in Afghanistan, you could easily make the case that those people are aware that there's a certain danger attached to being associated with these people. But you can't make that same argument for a creature that hasn't even formed a brain yet. It's completely unaware of what the circumstances in which it was created. And so punishing
And
it
yet
for the crime of another
it's
is
entirely out of place because it shouldn't be there.
that. Who's to say what a and no, hold on. The a fe- Saying a fetus shouldn't be there and saying we should kill it are two very different arguments, though.
No, I mean one
Uh,
flows logically from the
well,
other. No, I
No,
think.
saying a fetus shouldn't be there doesn't mean all right, we get to kill it. It means you have it, it's done. You ship it off to somewhere else because you don't want to raise it. That's fine.
No, but
But
then
Still
say,
have
that means you're
limitations. I want to
essentially
interject
doing.
very
You're essentially.
quickly.
That means you're essentially just putting in the metabolic work for for another population group, and then doing them the service of shipping them the child after you've done it. Like, I hate to use crude terminology for this, but it's almost like this is like multi-level cooking almost. It is multi-level cuckoldry, right?
well, no,
Yeah,
it's not
but
cuckoldry because it's not voluntary. Like, but I get the idea of
I
what
want to
you're.
add something to this very
No,
quickly.
but no, but the reason
Again,
I'm
this
using
goes
that
back to
terminology.
the whole humanity.
Hold on. The reason I'm arguing, the reason I'm using that terminology suddenly is because technically speaking, if you could have removed it from existence but you chose not to, then I guess you did let it happen.
No, because the rape and the pregnancy and the child are three different events, and although they're related, they are not the same.
No, but the outcome, if you say, if you were to say that, that one of these outcomes is not this, the outcome is not cuckoldry because what was how are you rationalizing that it was not cuckoldry?
Because again, because it's not raising the child.
No, but you're still essentially letting that 9 months transpire, and then you're letting that person have your genetic information, and then you're effectively doing them a service for nothing, and
Yeah,
you're permitting it to happen, even though
Okay,
you have the power, to not let that happen.
well, yeah, that's because the thing that's being created is this isn't simply a matter of, well, oh, you've been secretly doing them this service that's aiding them in, say, you've been working on some, dirty bomb for 9 months and you were unaware of it. And now it's like they've got this new technology. This is, again, it comes back to the fundamental worth of a human life, which transcends any practical considerations of cost benefit. It's not.
How can it transcend the practical consideration of your own national survival, though? I think a lot
Because
of people, even if people did agree somewhat with what you were saying here, I think a lot of people would actually say that they would be willing to accept the quote unquote sin, quote unquote, massive air quotes here, okay? The quote unquote sin of having done that, they would be willing to accept that if the purpose is survival.
I understand people would be willing to accept it. That doesn't make those people right, of course, though.
Well, okay, well, what is the measurement of what is right or wrong then?
What is set up
Like
as,
if you take a series of actions which at every step your book says that these are the correct actions, but they result in your extinction, those cannot be the correct actions in
you're
my view.
implying. See, but that's the thing, though. Raising There's never going to be an epidemic of rape babies so massive that it's going to lead to the extinction of any tribe.
Indeed,
You're
but I was saying
proposing an
that
absurdity here.
indeed, but I'm just saying that on principle, that if you're not, if that it becomes difficult for a person to enunciate any particular form of ethno-nationalism if on principle they cannot answer that they would actually destroy all of these invading rape babies.
Well, here's the
It only sounds ridiculous if you were to think of it in a purely practical sense, because obviously it is very difficult for that scenario to actually unfold. But if you were to think about it just purely conceptually, that means you're actually not putting ethnicity first if you think that there is a scenario that could hypothetically occur in which you would willingly allow someone to erase you.
well, I'm
now,
I'm all
Pragmatic, I
for,
have a question for you very quickly,
sure.
if you don't mind. I just want to interject very quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Um, so, I think, in addition to the argument I provided earlier about how the fetus is now, one of the people in the stream chat actually gave the definition of a parasite, and I think his intention was to demonstrate that to some extent or another, a fetus definitely does have parasitic traits. So, and I thought Ray was going to defend that argument, but that's perfectly okay. We'll get into that later, hopefully. But here's my question for you. Couldn't it also be argued the mother has the right to choose whether or not to give birth based on practicality? Because here's the thing, most societies that have outlawed abortion are complete shitholes, or would be complete shitholes if they kept it outlawed. I'll give two examples very quickly. One is Romania. When Ceausescu, I butchered his name, I apologize, but when he outlawed abortion in Romania, birth rate skyrocketed, which was his intention, but also there was a huge spike in crime, and there was also orphanages everywhere, and they had the highest child poverty rate in the world, in Europe at least, because of this fact. And also Roe v. Wade. If we didn't have Roe v. Wade, according to a study conducted by one of the authors of Freakonomics, had a Roe v. Wade never came into fruition, crime rates in the 90s would have been huge because the children that would be criminals would have been born en masse, and we would have had more of an excess population of criminals. So in the long term, isn't a woman's right to choose to give birth or not uh, basically guaranteed as an axiom based on the fact when you deny them that right, because the fetus has the right to life. We have to respect the humanity of the fetus. That leads to disastrous consequences for society in the long term.
Okay, so I'm going to disagree vehemently with what was stated here, simply because this is very pure and blatant determinism. There's no way to know that, you have this child and it's going to come out a criminal. Obviously, there are certain statistical models that can sort of weigh in and make some predictions about this, but you don't just get to say, well, this child may contribute to the criminal population, therefore, he no longer, we get to decide his execution
No,
now
we
as
can't
opposed to
determine
later.
which fetuses are going to grow up to become criminals, but we can definitely say that the ability for women to seek abortions in general allows for crime rates to drop, and that's been empirically demonstrated through massive, massive research into the topic.
Well,
And
no,
again,
just
look at
because
Romania.
these women
Look
gave
at
birth
what
does
happened
not
to
mean the
Romania.
crime rates went up. The crime rates went up because people didn't actually raise these children right. More births does not equal more
I'm talking
criminals
about the
unless you're
90s, because in
living
the
in a shitty
90s,
society. So maybe
or,
what these studies have proven is that Romania and possibly the United States live in very morally shitty societies. But I refuse to accept this conflation that the correlation between higher births equals more criminals. I refuse to accept that the correlation
it's
equals
happening in
causation.
Africa right now. In Africa, if you just take into account the fact that most foreign-born terrorists come from Africa and the Middle East, do you really think high birth rates in these countries is good for American national security? If most
Yeah,
of
good question, actually. Good question. I was about to get to the national security thing eventually, too.
Yeah, well, is it good for American national security if there are more Africans? Well, inherently, no, it doesn't have to be. It could become a problem if these more children are exposed to a radical ideology that
which most
allows. Yeah, most of them might be, but the problem then isn't the fact that there are more of them. The problem is the radical ideology.
Yeah, but let's think about it for a second. Are we going to abolish these radical ideologies overnight? No.
Of course
So you
not.
have to adapt to the circumstances. And so
No,
far,
no,
the
no,
only
no,
way we can adapt to the circumstances in these countries is to promote reproductive choice in these countries, as Ray would put
no.
it.
No,
Well, hold on
there's
one second. Hold
there's
on
a
one second.
pantheon of other activities we can engage in that
Of
would allow
course,
us to adapt to
but
these
there is a
circumstances well
question I want to add
before
on to this.
contraception and abortion.
There is a question I wanted to add on to this because up until now we've only been discussing abortion in the context that Nero was just using, and the context which I had used it in, which was basically the principles context of do you think that nation and family come first, or do you think that the abstract idea of the right to life comes first? Now, obviously, from my perspective, I do not put the right to life first at the top of the stack under any circumstances, whereas and it's clear that pragmatic seems to do so, right? The question I have, though, is that what if you were to dodge around this problem and we had the halfway house, because we haven't actually discussed this yet, where what if I don't ask you about abortion, but I instead ask you about birth control? In such a case, we haven't actually removed the fetus from existence because the fetus has never come into existence. Are you in favor of that?
Okay, so this is a very different discussion, and I'll answer it briefly and I'll give you guys time to respond, but after that I think I'm going to have to end it because it's getting fairly late. So just to
Yeah,
respond
there's going to
briefly.
have to be a part two, by the way. I didn't realize it would go on this long. But there's going to have to be a part two.
Sure, I'm more than happy with that. But to answer briefly, I would be against that, not on the grounds that it's a crime equal to murder, as the case with abortion would be, but I would be against it on the grounds that it is subverting the natural process of the ability of a woman to give birth. And that's a much deeper, more complex metaphysical argument than I think we have time left for.
What? No, really though, I have to put my foot on this one. I'm sorry, because this means that okay, you reusing the same example of the invader as before. You're saying that if you're about to be invaded by a bunch of extremely rapey people, right? You're saying that people should not take birth control in the expectation that it may be useful.
Yes, that is indeed what I would say.
Unbelievable! Oh.
All right. We'll leave it there with Ray's befuddlement at my unwillingness to compromise on my moral stances. But
part two, we will discuss
oh my gosh.
further, because I had a lot more arguments on the table that I've not been able to bring to the table tonight. But hopefully, I will next time.
Yes, you've been very silent, Nero, and we thank you. We thank you for your patience.
In part two, we're going to have to cover that because that was the most astonishing response I've ever received on that question, and we haven't even
I was very silent.
Yeah, and we haven't even gone
to the overall topic throughout the entire. I apologize for being so silent during the entire stream.
It's
more than okay.
We haven't even gone to the overall topic of how women's rights pertains to international development yet. Yeah. We're sort of just getting started. But that response was incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, after all of that we went through, then even if there's not a fetus created, you are saying that that they should not take birth control to defend themselves from a potential attacker.
It is a different degree of crime. However, I will contend you that taking birth control is less of a moral aberration than actually getting an abortion or killing the zygote, as you would say.
But
I don't know if that's any concession.
It really isn't, because I'm sure that anyone observing this can clearly see that there must. I mean, it's not. How can I put this? There's usually the people who say that this is not about arranging systems in particular ways which are deliberately disadvantageous to women, and then there are those who are saying that no, it's that really. The Catholics believe in a right to life, and that's the only reason why they're doing what they're doing. But if the latter were the case, when I ask you about birth control, then you should actually not have given the response that you just gave. The response that you just gave seems to indicate that it really is actually about constraining the ability of women to control our own reproductive systems.
Well, I can understand why you would think that way, and I'll have to lay out the argument for why that is not the case. Next time. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning into this most interesting of streams that covered a whole variety of topics I was very happy to cover. And thank you to my guests for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks. We'll see you again.
Yes. Have a wonderful night, everybody.